Chapter 1 Arrest Conversation with Mrs. Grubach. Then Miss Burstner, someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but, one morning, he was arrested. Every day at 8 in the morning he was brought his breakfast by Mrs. Grubach's cook. Mrs. Grubach was his landlady, but today she didn't come. That had never happened before. Kay waited a little while, looked from his pillow at the old woman who lived opposite and who was watching him with an inquisitiveness quite unusual for her, and finally, both hungry and disconcerted, rang the bell. There was immediately a knock at the door and a man entered. He had never seen the man in this house before. He was slim but firmly built, his clothes were black and close-fitting, with many folds and pockets, buckles and buttons and a belt, all of which gave the impression of being very practical, but without making it very clear what they were actually for. "Who are you?" asked Kay, sitting half upright in his bed. The man, however, ignored the question as if his arrival simply had to be accepted, and merely replied, "You rang? Anna should have brought me my breakfast," said Kay. He tried to work out who the man actually was, first in silence, just through observation and by thinking about it, but the man didn't stay still to be looked at for very long. Instead he went over to the door, opened it slightly, and said to someone who was clearly standing immediately behind it, "He wants Anna to bring him his breakfast." There was a little laughter in the neighboring room. It was not clear from the sound of it whether there were several people laughing. The strange man could not have learned anything from it that he hadn't known already, but now he said to Kay, as if making his report, "It is not possible." "It would be the first time that's happened," said Kay, as he jumped out of bed and quickly pulled on his trousers. "I want to see who that is in the next room, and why it is that Mrs. Grubach has let me be disturbed in this way." It immediately occurred to him that he need have said this out loud, and that he must to some extent have acknowledged their authority by doing so, but that didn't seem important to him at the time. That, at least, is how the stranger took it, as he said, "Don't you think you'd better stay where you are? I want neither to stay here nor to be spoken to by you until you've introduced yourself." "I meant it for your own good," said the stranger and opened the door, this time without being asked. The next room, which Kay entered more slowly than he had intended, looked at first glance exactly the same as it had the previous evening. It was Mrs. Grubach's living room, overfilled with furniture, tablecloths, porcelain and photographs. Perhaps there was a little more space in there than usual today, but if so it was not immediately obvious, especially as the main difference was the presence of a man sitting by the open window with a book from which he now looked up. "You should have stayed in your room. Didn't Franz tell you? And what is it you want, then?" said Kay, looking back and forth between this new acquaintance and the one named Franz, who had remained in the doorway. Through the open window he noticed the old woman again, who had come close to the window opposite so that she could continue to see everything. She was showing an inquisitiveness that really made it seem like she was going senile. "I want to see Mrs. Grubach," said Kay, making a movement as if tearing himself away from the two men, even though they were standing well away from him and wanted to go. "No," said the man at the window, who threw his book down on a coffee table and stood up. "You can't go away when you're under arrest." "That's how it seems," said Kay. "And why am I under arrest?" he then asked. "That's something we're not allowed to tell you. Go into your room and wait there. Proceedings are underway and you'll learn about everything all in good time. It's not really part of my job to be friendly towards you like this, but I hope no one, apart from Franz, will hear about it, and he's been more friendly towards you than he should have been, under the rules, himself. If you carry on having as much good luck as you have been with your arresting officers, then you can reckon on things going well with you." Kay wanted to sit down, but then he saw that, apart from the chair by the window, there was nowhere anywhere in the room where he could sit. "You'll get the chance to see for yourself how true all this is," said Franz, and both men then walked up to Kay. They were significantly bigger than him, especially the second man, who frequently slapped him on the shoulder. The two of them felt Kay's nightshirt and said he would now have to wear one that was of much lower quality, but that they would keep the nightshirt along with his other underclothes and return them to him if his case turned out well. "It's better for you if you give us the things than if you leave them in the storeroom," they said. "Things have a tendency to go missing in the storeroom, and after a certain amount of time they sell things off, whether the case involved has come to an end or not. And cases like this can last a long time, especially the ones that have been coming up lately. They'd give you the money they got for them, but it wouldn't be very much, as it's not what they're offered for them when they sell them that counts, it's how much they get slipped on the side, and things like that lose their value anyway when they get passed on from hand to hand, year after year." Kay paid hardly any attention to what they were saying. He did not place much value on what he may have still possessed or on who decided what happened to them. It was much more important to him to get a clear understanding of his position, but he could not think clearly while these people were here. The second policeman's belly, and they could only be policemen, looked friendly enough, sticking out towards him, but when Kay looked up and saw his dry, bony face, it did not seem to fit with the body. His strong nose twisted to one side as if ignoring Kay and sharing an understanding with the other policeman. What sort of people were these? What were they talking about? What office did they belong to? Kay was living in a free country, after all, everywhere was at peace, all laws were decent and were upheld. Who was it who dared accost him in his own home? He was always inclined to take life as lightly as he could, to cross bridges when he came to them, pay no heed for the future, even when everything seemed under threat. But here that did not seem the right thing to do. He could have taken it all as a joke, a big joke set up by his colleagues at the bank for some unknown reason, or also perhaps because today was his 30th birthday. It was all possible, of course. Maybe all he had to do was laugh in the policeman's face in some way, and they would laugh with him. Maybe they were tradesmen from the corner of the street. They looked like they might be, but he was nonetheless determined, ever since he first caught sight of the one called Franz, not to lose any slight advantage he might have had over these people. There was a very slight risk that people would later say he couldn't understand a joke, but although he wasn't normally in the habit of learning from experience, he might also have had a few unimportant occasions in mind when, unlike his more cautious friends, he had acted with no thought at all for what might follow and had been made to suffer for it. He didn't want that to happen again, not this time at least. If they were play acting, he would act along with them. He still had time. "Allow me," he said, and hurried between the two policemen through into his room. "He seems sensible enough," he heard them say behind him. Once in his room, he quickly pulled open the drawer of his writing desk. Everything in it was very tidy, but in his agitation, he was unable to find the identification documents he was looking for straight away. He finally found his bicycle permit and was about to go back to the policeman with it when it seemed to him too petty, so he carried on searching until he found his birth certificate. Just as he got back in the adjoining room, the door on the other side opened and Mrs. Grubach was about to enter. He only saw her for an instant, for as soon as she recognized Kay she was clearly embarrassed, asked for forgiveness and disappeared, closing the door behind her very carefully. "Do come in," Kay could have said just then. But now he stood in the middle of the room with his papers in his hand and still looking at the door, which did not open again. He stayed like that until he was startled out of it by the shout of the policeman who sat at the little table at the open window and, as Kay now saw, was eating his breakfast. "Why didn't she come in?" he asked. "She's not allowed to," said the big policeman. "You're under arrest, aren't you?" "But how can I be under arrest? And how come it's like this?" "Now you're starting again," said the policeman, dipping a piece of buttered bread in the honey pot. "We don't answer questions like that." "You will have to answer them," said Kay. "Here are my identification papers, now show me yours, and I certainly want to see the arrest warrant." "Oh, my God," said the policeman. "In a position like yours, and you think you can start giving orders, do you? It won't do you any good to get us on the wrong side, even if you think it will. We're probably more on your side than anyone else you know." "That's true, you know, you'd better believe it," said Franz, holding a cup of coffee in his hand which he did not lift to his mouth, but looked at Kay in a way that was probably meant to be full of meaning, but could not actually be understood. Kay found himself, without intending it, in a mute dialogue with Franz, but then slapped his hand down on his papers and said, "Here are my identity documents." "And what do you want us to do about it?" replied the big policeman, loudly. "The way you're carrying on, it's worse than a child. What is it you want? Do you want to get this great bloody trial of yours over with quickly by talking about ID and arrest warrants with us? We're just coppers, that's all we are. Junior officers like us hardly know one end of an ID card from another. All we've got to do with you is keep an eye on you for 10 hours a day and get paid for it. That's all we are. Mind you, what we can do is make sure that the high officials we work for find out just what sort of person it is they're going to arrest and why he should be arrested before they issue the warrant. There's no mistake there. Our authorities, as far as I know, and I only know the lowest grades, don't go out looking for guilt among the public. It's the guilt that draws them out, like it says in the law, and they have to send us police officers out. That's the law. Where do you think there'd be any mistake there?" "I don't know this law," said Kay. "So much the worse for you, then," said the policeman. It's probably exists only in your head, said Kay. He wanted, in some way, to insinuate his way into the thoughts of the policeman, to reshape those thoughts to his benefit or to make himself at home there. But the policeman just said dismissively, "You'll find out when it affects you." Franz joined in and said, "Look at this, Willem, he admits he doesn't know the law and at the same time insists he's innocent." "You're quite right, but we can't get him to understand a thing," said the other. Kay stopped talking with them. He thought to himself, do I really have to carry on getting tangled up with the chattering of base functionaries like this? And they admit themselves that they are of the lowest position. They're talking about things of which they don't have the slightest understanding, anyway. It's only because of their stupidity that they're able to be so sure of themselves. I just need few words with someone of the same social standing as myself, and everything will be incomparably clearer, much clearer than a long conversation with these two can make it. He walked up and down the free space in the room a couple of times. Across the street he could see the old woman who, now, had pulled an old man, much older than herself, up to the window and had her arms around him. Kay had to put an end to this display. "Take me to your superior," he said. "As soon as he wants to see you." "Not before," said the policeman, the one called Willem. "And now my advice to you," he added, "is to go into your room, stay calm, and wait and see what's to be done with you. If you take her advice, you won't tire yourself out thinking about things to no purpose. You need to pull yourself together as there's a lot that's going to require of you. You've not behaved towards us the way we deserve after being so good to you. You forget that we, whatever we are, we're still free men and you're not, and that's quite an advantage. But in spite of all that we're still willing, if you've got the money, to go and get you some breakfast from the cafe over the road." Without giving any answer to this offer, Kay stood still for some time. Perhaps, if he opened the door of the next room or even the front door, the two of them would not dare to stand in his way. Perhaps that would be the simplest way to settle the whole thing, by bringing it to a head. But maybe they would grab him, and if he were thrown down on the ground he would lose all the advantage he, in a certain respect, had over them. So he decided on the more certain solution, the way things would go in the natural course of events, and went back in his room without another word either from him or from the policeman. He threw himself down on his bed, and from the dressing table, he took the nice apple that he had put there the previous evening for his breakfast. Now it was all the breakfast he had, and anyway, as he confirmed as soon as he took his first big bite of it, it was far better than a breakfast he could have had through the goodwill of the policeman from the dirty cafe. He felt well and confident. He had failed to go into work at the bank this morning, but that could easily be excused because of the relatively high position he held there. Should he really send in his explanation? He wondered about it. If nobody believed him, and in this case that would be understandable, he could bring Mrs. Grubach in as a witness, or even the old pair from across the street, who probably even now were on their way over to the window opposite. It puzzled Kay, at least it puzzled him looking at it. From the policeman's point of view, that they had made him go into the room and left him alone there, where he had 10 different ways of killing himself. At the same time, though, he asked himself, this time looking at it from his own point of view, what reason he could have to do so. Because those two were sitting there in the next room and had taken his breakfast, perhaps. It would have been so pointless to kill himself that, even if he had wanted to, the pointlessness would have made him unable. Maybe, if the policemen had not been so obviously limited in their mental abilities, it could have been supposed that they had come to the same conclusion and saw no danger in leaving him alone because of it. They could watch now, if they wanted, and see how he went over to the cupboard in the wall where he kept a bottle of good schnapps, how he first emptied a glass of it in place of his breakfast, and how he then took a second glassful, in order to give himself courage, the last one just as a precaution for the unlikely chance it would be needed. Then he was so startled by a shout to him from the other room that he struck his teeth against the glass. "The supervisor wants to see you," a voice said. It was only the shout that startled him, this curt, abrupt military shout that he would not have expected from the policeman called Franz. In itself, he found the order very welcome. At last, he called back, locked the cupboard and, without delay, hurried into the next room. The two policemen were standing there and chased him back into his bedroom, as if that were a matter of course. "What do you think you're doing?" they cried. "Think you're going to see the supervisor dressed in just your shirt, do you? He'd see to it you got a right thumping, and us and all. Let go of me for God's sake," called Kay, who had already been pushed back as far as his wardrobe. "If you accost me when I'm still in bed, you can't expect to find me in my evening dress." "That won't help you," said the policeman, who always became very quiet, almost sad, when Kay began to shout, and in that way confused him or, to some extent, brought him to his senses. Ridiculous formalities, he grumbled as he lifted his coat from the chair and kept it in both his hands for a little while, as if holding it out for the policeman's inspection. They shook their heads. "It's got to be a black coat," they said. At that, Kay threw the coat to the floor and said without knowing even himself what he meant by it, "Well, it's not going to be the main trial, after all." The policeman laughed, but continued to insist, "It's got to be a black coat." "Well, that's all right by me if it makes things go any faster," said Kay. He opened the wardrobe himself, spent a long time searching through all the clothes, and chose his best black suit, which had a short jacket that had greatly surprised those who knew him. Then he also pulled out a fresh shirt and began, carefully, to get dressed. He secretly told himself that he had succeeded in speeding things up by letting the policemen forget to make him have a bath. He watched them to see if they might remember after all, but of course it never occurred to them, although Willem did not forget to send Franz up to the supervisor with the message saying that Kay was getting dressed. Once he was properly dressed, Kay had to pass by Willem as he went through the next room into the one beyond, the door of which was already wide open. Kay knew very well that this room had recently been let to a typist called Miss Burstner. She was in the habit of going out to work very early and coming back home very late, and Kay had never exchanged more than a few words of greeting with her. Now, her bedside table had been pulled into the middle of the room to be used as a desk for these proceedings, and the supervisor sat behind it. He had his legs crossed and had thrown one arm over the backrest of the chair. In one corner of the room there were three young people looking at the photographs belonging to Miss Burstner that had been put into a piece of fabric on the wall. Hung up on the handle of the open window was a white blouse. At the window across the street, there was the old pair again, although now their number had increased, as behind them, and far taller than they were, stood a man with an open shirt that showed his chest and a reddish goatee beard which he squeezed and twisted with his fingers. "Joseph Kay?" asked the supervisor, perhaps merely to attract Kay's attention as he looked round the room. Kay nodded. "I dare say you were quite surprised by all that's been taking place this morning," said the supervisor, as, with both hands, he pushed away the few items on the bedside table, the candle and box of matches, a book and a pin cushion, which lay there as if they were things he would need for his own business. "Certainly," said Kay, and he began to feel relaxed now that, at last, he stood in front of someone with some sense, someone with whom he would be able to talk about his situation. "Certainly I'm surprised, but I'm not in any way very surprised." "You're not very surprised?" asked the supervisor, as he positioned the candle in the middle of the table and the other things in a group around it. "Perhaps you don't quite understand me," Kay hurriedly pointed out. "What I mean is," here Kay broke off what he was saying and looked round for somewhere to sit. "I may sit down, mayn't I?" he asked. "That's not usual," the supervisor answered. "What I mean is," said Kay without delaying a second time, "that, yes, I am very surprised, but when you've been in the world for 30 years already and had to make your own way through everything yourself, which has been my lot, then you become hardened to surprises and don't take them too hard. Especially not what's happened today." "Why especially not what's happened today?" "I wouldn't want to say that I see all of this as a joke. You seem to have gone to too much trouble making all these arrangements for that. Everyone in the house must be taking part in it as well as all of you. That would be going beyond what could be a joke. So I don't want to say that this is a joke." "Quite right," said the supervisor, looking to see how many matches were left in the box. "But on the other hand," Kay went on, looking round at everyone there, and even wishing he could get the attention of the three who were looking at the photographs, "on the other hand, this really can't be all that important. That follows from the fact that I've been indicted, but can't think of the slightest offense for which I could be indicted. But even that is all beside the point. The main question is, who is issuing the indictment? What office is conducting this affair? Are you officials? None of you is wearing a uniform, unless what you are wearing here," he turned towards Franz, "is meant to be a uniform. It's actually more of a traveling suit. I require a clear answer to all these questions, and I'm quite sure that once things have been made clear, we can take our leave of each other on the best of terms." The supervisor slammed the box of matches down on the table. "You're making a big mistake," he said. "These gentlemen and I have got nothing to do with your business. In fact, we know almost nothing about you. We could be wearing uniforms as proper and exact as you like, and your situation wouldn't be any the worse for it. As to whether you're on a charge, I can't give you any sort of clear answer to that. I don't even know whether you are or not. You're under arrest, you're quite right about that, but I don't know any more than that. Maybe these officers have been chit-chatting with you. Well, if they have, that's all it is, chit-chit. I can't give you an answer to your questions, but I can give you a bit of advice. You'd better think less about us and what's going to happen to you, and think a bit more about yourself. And stop making all this fuss about your sense of innocence. You don't make such a bad impression, but with all this fuss you're damaging it. And you ought to do a bit less talking, too. Almost everything you've said so far has been things we could have taken from your behavior, even if you'd said no more than a few words. And what you have said has not exactly been in your favor. Kay stared at the supervisor. Was this man, probably younger than he was, lecturing him like a schoolmaster? Was he being punished for his honesty with a telling off? And was he to learn nothing about the reasons for his arrest or those who were arresting him? He became somewhat cross and began to walk up and down. No one stopped him doing this, and he pushed his sleeves back, felt his chest, straightened his hair, went over to the three men, said, "It makes no sense," at which these three turned round to face him and came towards him with serious expressions. He finally came again to a halt in front of the supervisor's desk. "State Attorney Haster is a good friend of mine," he said. "Can I telephone him?" "Certainly," said the supervisor, "but I don't know what the point of that will be. I suppose you must have some private matter you want to discuss with him." "What the point is?" shouted Kay, more disconcerted than cross. "Who do you think you are? You want to see some point in it while you're carrying out something as pointless as it could be? It's enough to make you cry. These gentlemen first accost me, and now they sit or stand about in here and let me be hauled up in front of you. What point there would be in telephoning a state attorney when I'm ostensibly under arrest? Very well, I won't make the telephone call. You can call him if you want to," said the supervisor, stretching his head out towards the outer room where the telephone was. "Please, go on, do make your phone call." "No, I don't want to anymore," said Kay, and went over to the window. Across the street, the people were still there at the window, and it was only now that Kay had gone up to his window that they seemed to become uneasy about quietly watching what was going on. The old couple wanted to get up, but the man behind them calmed them down. "We've got some kind of audience over there," called Kay to the supervisor, quite loudly, as he pointed out with his forefinger. "Go away," he then called across to them. And the three of them did immediately retreat a few steps. The old pair even found themselves behind the man, who then concealed them with the breadth of his body and seemed, going by the movements of his mouth, to be saying something incomprehensible into the distance. They did not disappear entirely, though, but seemed to be waiting for the moment when they could come back to the window without being noticed. "Intrusive, thoughtless people," said Kay as he turned back into the room. The supervisor may have agreed with him, at least Kay thought that was what he saw from the corner of his eye. But it was just as possible that he had not even been listening, as he had his hand pressed firmly down on the table and seemed to be comparing the length of his fingers. The two policemen were sitting on a chest covered with a colored blanket, rubbing their knees. The three young people had put their hands on their hips and were looking round aimlessly. Everything was still, like in some office that has been forgotten about. "Now, gentlemen," called out Kay, and for a moment it seemed as if he was carrying all of them on his shoulders, "it looks like your business with me is over with. In my opinion, it's best now to stop wondering about whether you're proceeding correctly or incorrectly, and to bring the matter to a peaceful close with a mutual handshake. If you are of the same opinion, then please," and he walked up to the supervisor's desk and held out his hand to him. The supervisor raised his eyes, bit his lip and looked at Kay's outstretched hand. Kay, still 18, the trial, believed the supervisor would do as he suggested. But instead, he stood up, picked up a hard round hat that was laying on Miss Burstner's bed, and put it carefully onto his head, using both hands as if trying on a new hat. "Everything seems so simple to you, doesn't it?" he said to Kay as he did so. "So you think we should bring the matter to a peaceful close, do you?" No, that won't do. Mind you, on the other hand, I certainly wouldn't want you to think there's no hope for you. No, why should you think that? You're simply under arrest, nothing more than that. That's what I had to tell you, that's what I've done, and now I've seen how you've taken it. That's enough for one day, and we can take our leave of each other, for the time being at least. I expect you'll want to go into the bank now, won't you?" "Into the bank?" asked Kay. "I thought I was under arrest." Kay said this with a certain amount of defiance as, although his handshake had not been accepted, he was feeling more independent of all these people, especially since the supervisor had stood up. He was playing with them. If they left, he had decided he would run after them and offer to let them arrest him. That's why he even repeated, "How can I go into the bank when I'm under arrest?" "I see you've misunderstood me," said the supervisor who was already at the door. "It's true that you're under arrest, but that shouldn't stop you from carrying out your job. And there shouldn't be anything to stop you carrying on with your usual life." "In that case it's not too bad, being under arrest," said Kay, and went up close to the supervisor. "I never meant it should be anything else," he replied. "It hardly seems to have been necessary. Notify me of the arrest in that case," said Kay, and went even closer. The others had also come closer. All of them had gathered together into a narrow space by the door. "That was my duty," said the supervisor. "A silly duty," said Kay, unyielding. "Maybe so," replied the supervisor, "only don't let's waste our time talking on like this. I had assumed you'd be wanting to go to the bank. As you're paying close attention to every word I'll add this. I'm not forcing you to go to the bank, I just assumed you wanted to. And to make things easier for you, and to let you get to the bank with as little fuss as possible, I've put these three gentlemen, colleagues of yours, at your disposal." "What's that?" exclaimed Kay, and looked at the three in astonishment. He could only remember seeing them in their group by the photographs, but these characterless, anemic young people were indeed officials from his bank, not colleagues of his. That was putting it too high, and it showed a gap in the omniscience of the supervisor, but they were nonetheless junior members of staff at the bank. How could Kay have failed to see that? How occupied he must have been with the supervisor and the policeman not to have recognized these three. Rabensteiner, with his stiff demeanor and swinging hands, Kulik, with his blonde hair and deep-set eyes, and Kaminer, with his involuntary grin caused by chronic muscle spasms. "Good morning," said Kay after a while, extending his hand to the gentlemen as they bowed correctly to him. "I didn't recognize you at all. So, we'll go into work now, shall we?" The gentleman laughed and nodded enthusiastically, as if that was what they had been waiting for all the time, except that Kay had left his hat in his room, so they all dashed, one after another, into the room to fetch it, which caused a certain amount of embarrassment. Kay stood where he was and watched them through the open double doorway. The last to go, of course, was the apathetic Rabensteiner, who had broken into no more than an elegant trot. Kaminer got to the hat, and Kay, as he often had to do at the bank, forcibly reminded himself that the grin was not deliberate, that he in fact wasn't able to grin deliberately. At that moment Mrs. Grubach opened the door from the hallway into the living room where all the people were. She did not seem to feel guilty about anything at all, and Kay, as often before, looked down at the belt of her apron which, for no reason, cut so deeply into her hefty body. Once downstairs, Kay, with his watch in his hand, decided to take a taxi. He had already been delayed by half an hour, and there was no need to make the delay any longer. Kaminer ran to the corner to summon it, and the two others were making obvious efforts to keep Kay diverted when Kulik pointed to the doorway of the house on the other side of the street, where the large man with the blonde goatee beard appeared, and, a little embarrassed at first at letting himself be seen in his full height, stepped back to the wall and leant against it. The old couple were probably still on the stairs. Kay was cross with Kulik for pointing out this man whom he had already seen himself, in fact whom he had been expecting. "Don't look at him," he snapped, without noticing how odd it was to speak to free men in this way. But there was no explanation needed anyway, as just then the taxi arrived. They sat inside and set off. Inside the taxi, Kay remembered that he had not noticed the supervisor and the policeman leaving. The supervisor had stopped him noticing the three bank staff, and now the three bank staff had stopped him noticing the supervisor. This showed that Kay was not very attentive, and he resolved to watch himself more carefully in this respect. Nonetheless, he gave it no thought as he twisted himself round and leant over onto the rear shelf of the car to catch sight of the supervisor and the policeman if he could. But he turned back round straight away and leant comfortably into the corner of the taxi without even having made the effort to see anyone. Although it did not seem like it, now was just the time when he needed some encouragement, but the gentleman seemed tired just then. Rabensteiner looked out of the car to the right, Kulik to the left, and only Kaminer was there with his grin at Kay's service. It would have been inhumane to make fun of that. That spring, whenever possible, Kay usually spent his evenings after work. He usually stayed in the office until 9 o'clock with a short walk, either by himself or in the company of some of the bank officials, and then he would go into a pub, where he would sit at the regulars' table with mostly older men until 11. There were, however, also exceptions to this habit, times, for instance, when Kay was invited by the bank's manager, whom he greatly respected for his industry and trustworthiness, to go with him for a ride in his car, or to eat dinner with him at his large house. Kay would also go, once a week, to see a girl called Elsa, who worked as a waitress in a wine bar through the night until late in the morning. During the daytime she only received visitors while still in bed. That evening, though, the day had passed quickly with a lot of hard work and many respectful and friendly birthday greetings. Kay wanted to go straight home. Each time he had any small break from the day's work he considered, without knowing exactly what he had in mind, that Mrs. Grubach's flat seemed to have been put into great disarray by the events of that morning, and that it was up to him to put it back into order. Once order had been restored, every trace of those events would have been erased, and everything would take its previous course once more. In particular, there was nothing to fear from the three bank officials. They had immersed themselves back into their paperwork, and there was no alteration to be seen in them. Kay had called each of them, separately or all together, into his office that day for no other reason than to observe them. He was always satisfied and had always been able to let them go again. At 9:30 that evening, when he arrived back in front of the building where he lived, he met a young lad in the doorway who was standing there, his legs apart and smoking a pipe. "Who are you?" immediately asked Kay, bringing his face close to the lad's, as it was hard to see in the half-light of the landing. "I'm the landlord's son," asked Kay, and impatiently knocked on the ground with his stick. "Did you want anything, sir? Would you like me to fetch my father?" "No, no," said Kay. There was something forgiving in his voice, as if the boy had harmed him in some way, and he was excusing him. "It's all right," he said then, and went on, but before going up the stairs he turned round once more. He could have gone directly to his room, but as he wanted to speak with Mrs. Grubach, he went straight to her door and knocked. She was sat at the table with a knitted stocking and a pile of old stockings in front of her. Kay apologized, a little embarrassed at coming so late, but Mrs. Grubach was very friendly and did not want to hear any apology. She was always ready to speak to him. He knew very well that he was her best and her favorite tenant. Kay looked round the room. It looked exactly as it usually did. The breakfast dishes, which had been on the table by the window that morning, had already been cleared away. A woman's hands will do many things when no one's looking, he thought. He might himself have smashed all the dishes on the spot, but certainly would not have been able to carry it all out. He looked at Mrs. Grubach with some gratitude. "Why are you working so late?" he asked. They were now both sitting at the table, and Kay now and then sank his hands into the pile of stockings. "There's a lot of work to do," she said. "During the day I belong to the tenants. If I'm to sort out my own things, there are only the evenings left to me. I fear I may have caused you some exceptional work today." "How do you mean, Mr. Kay?" she asked, becoming more interested and leaving her work in her lap. "I mean the men who were here this morning." "Oh, I see," she said, and went peacefully back to what she was doing. "That was no trouble, not especially." Kay looked on in silence as she took up the knitted stocking once more. "She seems surprised at my mentioning it," he thought. "She seems to think it's improper for me to mention it. All the more important for me to do so. An old woman is the only person I can speak about it with. But it must have caused some work for you," he said then, "but it won't happen again." "No, it can't happen again," she agreed, and smiled at Kay in a way that was almost pained. "Do you mean that seriously?" asked Kay. "Yes," she said, more gently, "but the important thing is you mustn't take it too hard. There are so many awful things happening in the world. As you're being so honest with me, Mr. Kay, I can admit to you that I listened to a little of what was going on from behind the door, and that those two policemen told me one or two things as well. It's all to do with your happiness, and that's something that's quite close to my heart, perhaps more than it should be, as I am, after all, only your landlady. Anyway, so I heard one or two things, but I can't really say that it's about anything very serious. No. You have been arrested, but it's not in the same way as when they arrest a thief. If you're arrested in the same way as a thief, then it's bad, but an arrest like this, it seems to me that it's something very complicated. Forgive me if I'm saying something stupid, something very complicated that I don't understand, but something that you don't really need to understand anyway. There's nothing stupid about what you said, Mrs. Grubach, or at least I partly agree with you, only, the way I judge the whole thing is harsher than yours, and think it's not only not something complicated, but simply a fuss about nothing. I was just caught unawares, that's what happened. If I had got up as soon as I was awake without letting myself get confused because Anna wasn't there, if I'd got up and paid no regard to anyone who might have been in my way and come straight to you, if I'd done something like having my breakfast in the kitchen as an exception, asked you to bring my clothes from my room. In short, if I had behaved sensibly, then nothing more would have happened, everything that was waiting to happen would have been stifled. People are so often unprepared. In the bank, for example, I am well prepared, nothing of this sort could possibly happen to me there. I have my own assistant there. There are telephones for internal and external calls in front of me on the desk. I continually receive visits from people, representatives, officials, but besides that, and most importantly, I'm always occupied with my work, that's to say I'm always alert. It would even be a pleasure for me to find myself faced with something of that sort. But now it's over with, and I didn't really even want to talk about it anymore, only I wanted to hear what you, as a sensible woman, thought about it all. And I'm very glad to hear that we're in agreement. But now you must give me your hand. An agreement of this sort needs to be confirmed with a handshake. Will she shake hands with me? The supervisor didn't shake hands, he thought, and looked at the woman differently from before, examining her. She stood up, as he had also stood up, and was a little self-conscious. She hadn't been able to understand everything that case said. As a result of this self-consciousness, she said something that she certainly did not intend and certainly was not appropriate. "Don't take it so hard, Mr. K," she said, with tears in her voice and also, of course, forgetting the handshake. "I didn't know I was taking it hard," said K, feeling suddenly tired and seeing that if this woman did agree with him, it was of very little value. Before going out the door he asked, "Is Miss Berstner home?" "No," said Mrs. Grubach, smiling as she gave this simple piece of information, saying something sensible at last. "She's at the theater. Did you want to see her? Should I give her a message?" I just wanted to have a few words with her. I'm afraid I don't know when she's coming in, she usually gets back late when she's been to the theater." "It really doesn't matter," said Kay, his head hanging as he turned to the door to leave. "I just wanted to give her my apology for taking over her room today." "There's no need for that, Mr. K, you're too conscientious, the young lady doesn't know anything about it, she hasn't been home since early this morning, and everything's been tidied up again, you can see for yourself." And she opened the door to Miss Berstner's room. "Thank you, I'll take your word for it," said Kay, but went nonetheless over to the open door. The moon shone quietly into the unlit room. As far as could be seen, everything was indeed in its place, not even the blouse was hanging on the window handle. The pillows on the bed looked remarkably plump as they lay half in the moonlight. "Miss Berstner often comes home late," said Kay, looking at Mrs. Grubach as if that were her responsibility. "That's how young people are," said Mrs. Grubach to excuse herself. Of course," said Kay, "but it can be taken too far." "Yes, it can be," said Mrs. Grubach, "you're so right, Mr. K, perhaps it is in this case. I certainly wouldn't want to say anything nasty about Miss Berstner, she is a good sweet girl, friendly, tidy, punctual, works hard, I appreciate all that very much, but one thing is true, she ought to have more pride, be a bit less forthcoming. Twice this month already, in the street over the way, I've seen her with a different gentleman. I really don't like saying this, you're the only one I've said this to, Mr. K, I swear to God, but I'm going to have no choice but to have a few words with Miss Berstner about it myself. And it's not the only thing about her that I'm worried about." "Mrs. Grubach, you are on quite the wrong track," said Kay, so angry that he was hardly able to hide it, "and you have moreover misunderstood what I was saying about Miss Berstner, that is not what I meant. In fact, I warn you quite directly not to say anything to her, you are quite mistaken, I know Miss Berstner very well, and there is no truth at all in what you say. And what's more, perhaps I'm going too far, I don't want to get in your way, say to her whatever you see fit. Good night." "Mr. K," said Mrs. Grubach as if asking him for something and hurrying to his door which he had already opened, "I don't want to speak to Miss Berstner at all, not yet, of course I'll continue to keep an eye on her, but you're the only one I've told what I know. And it is, after all, something that everyone who lets rooms has to do if she's to keep the house decent, that's all I'm trying to do." "Decent?" called out Kay through the crack in the door, "if you want to keep the house decent, you'll first have to give me notice." Then he slammed the door shut. There was a gentle knocking to which he paid no more attention. He did not feel at all like going to bed, so he decided to stay up, and this would also give him the chance to find out when Miss Berstner would arrive home. Perhaps it would also still be possible, even if a little inappropriate, to have a few words with her. As he lay there by the window, pressing his hands to his tired eyes, he even thought for a moment that he might punish Mrs. Grubach by persuading Miss Berstner to give in her notice at the same time as he would. But he immediately realized that that would be shockingly excessive, and there would even be the suspicion that he was moving house because of the incidents of that morning. Nothing would have been more nonsensical and, above all, more pointless and contemptible. When he had become tired of looking out onto the empty street, he slightly opened the door to the living room so that he could see anyone who entered the flat from where he was and lay down on the couch. He lay there, quietly smoking a cigar, until about 11 o'clock. He wasn't able to hold out longer than that and went a little way into the hallway, as if in that way he could make Miss Berstner arrive sooner. He had no particular desire for her, he could not even remember what she looked like, but now he wanted to speak to her, and it irritated him that her late arrival home meant this day would be full of unease and disorder right to its very end. It was also her fault that he had not had any dinner that evening, and that he had been unable to visit Elsa as he had intended. He could still make up for both of those things, though, if he went to the wine bar where Elsa worked. He wanted to do so even later, after the discussion with Miss Berstner. It was already gone 11:30 when someone could be heard in the stairway. Kay, who had been lost in his thoughts in the hallway, walking up and down loudly as if it were his own room, fled behind his door. Miss Berstner had arrived. Shivering, she pulled a silk shawl over her slender shoulders as she locked the door. The next moment she would certainly go into her room, where Kay ought not to intrude in the middle of the night. That meant he would have to speak to her now, but, unfortunately, he had not put the electric light on in his room, so that when he stepped out of the dark, it would give the impression of being an attack, and would certainly, at the very least, have been quite alarming. There was no time to lose, and in his helplessness he whispered through the crack of the door, "Miss Berstner." It sounded like he was pleading with her, not calling to her. "Is there someone there?" asked Miss Berstner, looking round with her eyes wide open. "It's me," said Kay, and came out. "Oh, Mr. Kay," said Miss Berstner with a smile. "Good evening," and offered him her hand. "I wanted to have a word with you, if you would allow me." "Now?" asked Miss Berstner. "Does it have to be now? It is a little odd, isn't it? I've been waiting for you since 9 o'clock. Well, I was at the theater, I didn't know anything about you waiting for me. The reason I need to speak to you only came up today. I see. Well, I don't see why not, I suppose, apart from being so tired I could drop. Come into my room for a few minutes then. We certainly can't talk out here, we'd wake everyone up, and I think that would be more unpleasant for us than for them. Wait here till I've put the light on in my room, and then turn the light down out here." Kay did as he was told, and then even waited until Miss Berstner came out of her room and quietly invited him, once more, to come in. "Sit down," she said, indicating the ottoman, while she herself remained standing by the bedpost. Despite the tiredness she had spoken of, she did not even take off her hat, which was small but decorated with an abundance of flowers. "What is it you wanted, then? I'm really quite curious." She gently crossed her legs. "I expect you'll say," Kay began, "that the matter really isn't all that urgent, and we don't need to talk about it right now, but I never listen to introductions," said Miss Berstner. "That makes my job so much easier," said Kay. "This morning, to some extent through my fault, your room was made a little untidy. This happened because of people I did not know and against my will, but, as I said, because of my fault, I wanted to apologize for it." "My room?" asked Miss Berstner, and instead of looking round the room scrutinized Kay. "It is true," said Kay, and now, for the first time, they looked each other in the eyes. "There's no point in saying exactly how this came about. But that's the interesting thing about it," said Miss Berstner. "No," said Kay. "Well then," said Miss Berstner, "I don't want to force my way into any secrets. If you insist that it's of no interest, I won't insist. I'm quite happy to forgive you for it, as you ask, especially as I can't see anything at all that's been left untidy." With her hand laid flat on her lower hip, she made a tour around the room. At the mat where the photographs were, she stopped. "Look at this," she cried. "My photographs really have been put in the wrong places. Oh, that's horrible. Someone really has been in my room without permission." Kay nodded and quietly cursed Kaminer, who worked at his bank and who was always active doing things that had neither use nor purpose. "It is odd," said Miss Berstner, "that I'm forced to forbid you to do something that you ought to have forbidden yourself to do, namely to come into my room when I'm not here." "But I did explain to you," said Kay, and went over to join her by the photographs, "that it wasn't me who interfered with your photographs, but as you don't believe me, I'll have to admit that the investigating committee brought along 3 bank employees with them. One of them must have touched your photographs, and as soon as I get the chance I'll ask to have him dismissed from the bank." Yes, there was an investigating committee here, added Kay, as the young lady was looking at him inquiringly. Because of you? She asked. Yes, answered Kay. No. The lady cried with a laugh. Yes, they were, said Kay. You believe that I'm innocent then, do you? Well now, innocent, said the lady. I don't want to start making any pronouncements that might have serious consequences. I don't really know you after all. It means they're dealing with a serious criminal if they send an investigating committee straight out to get him. But you're not in custody now, at least I take it you've not escaped from prison, considering that you seem quite calm, so you can't have committed any crime of that sort. Yes, said Kay, but it might be that the investigating committee could see that I'm innocent or not so guilty as had been supposed. Yes, that's certainly a possibility, said Miss Burstner, who seemed very interested. Listen, said Kay, you don't have much experience in legal matters. No, that's true, I don't, said Miss Burstner, and I've often regretted it, as I'd like to know everything, and I'm very interested in legal matters. There's something peculiarly attractive about the law, isn't there? But I'll certainly be perfecting my knowledge in this area, as next month I start work in a legal office. That's very good, said Kay. That means you'll be able to give me some help with my trial. That could well be, said Miss Burstner. Why not? I like to make use of what I know. I mean it quite seriously, said Kay, or at least, half seriously, as you do. This affair is too petty to call in a lawyer, but I could make good use of someone who could give me advice. Yes, but if I'm to give you advice I'll have to know what it's all about, said Miss Burstner. That's exactly the problem, said Kay. I don't know that myself. So you have been making fun of me, then, said Miss Burstner, exceedingly disappointed. You really ought not to try something like that on at this time of night. And she stepped away from the photographs where they had stood so long together. Miss Burstner, no, said Kay, I'm not making fun of you. Please believe me. I've already told you everything I know. More than I know, in fact, as it actually wasn't even an investigating committee, that's just what I called them, because I don't know what else to call them. There was no cross-questioning at all, I was merely arrested, but by a committee. Miss Burstner sat on the ottoman and laughed again. What was it like then? She asked. It was terrible, said Kay. Although his mind was no longer on the subject, he had become totally absorbed by Miss Burstner's gaze, who was supporting her chin on one hand, the elbow rested on the cushion of the ottoman, and slowly stroking her hip with the other. That's too vague, said Miss Burstner. What's too vague? Asked Kay. Then he remembered himself and asked, would you like me to show you what it was like? He wanted to move in some way but did not want to leave. I'm already tired, said Miss Burstner. You arrived back so late, said Kay. Now you've started telling me off. Well, I suppose I deserve it, as I shouldn't have let you in here in the first place, and it turns out there wasn't even any point. Oh, there was a point, you'll see now how important a point it was, said Kay. May I move this table away from your bedside and put it here? What do you think you're doing? Said Miss Burstner. Of course you can't. In that case I can't show you, said Kay, quite upset, as if Miss Burstner had committed some incomprehensible offense against him. All right then, if you need it to show what you mean, just take the bedside table then, said Miss Burstner, and after a short pause added in a weak voice, I'm so tired I'm allowing more than I ought to. Kay put the little table in the middle of the room and sat down behind it. You have to get a proper idea of where the people were situated, it is very interesting. I'm the supervisor, sitting over there on the chest are two policemen, standing next to the photographs there are three young people. Hanging on the handle of the window is a white blouse, I just mentioned that by the way. And now it begins. Ah yes, I'm forgetting myself, the most important person of all, so I'm standing here in front of the table. The supervisor is sitting extremely comfortably with his legs crossed and his arm hanging over the backrest here like some layabout. And now it really does begin. The supervisor calls out as if he had to wake me up, in fact he shouts at me. I'm afraid, if I'm to make it clear to you, I'll have to shout as well, and it's nothing more than my name that he shouts out. Miss Burstner, laughing as she listened to him, laid her forefinger on her mouth, so that Kay would not shout, but it was too late. Kay was too engrossed in his role and slowly called out, Joseph K. It was not as loud as he had threatened, but nonetheless, once he had suddenly called it out, the cry seemed gradually to spread itself all round the room. There was a series of loud, curt and regular knocks at the door of the adjoining room. Miss Burstner went pale and laid her hand on her heart. Kay was especially startled, as for a moment he had been quite unable to think of anything other than the events of that morning and the girl for whom he was performing them. He had hardly pulled himself together when he jumped over to Miss Burstner and took her hand. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, "I'll put everything right." "But who can it be?" "It's only the living room next door, nobody sleeps in there." "Yes they do," whispered Miss Burstner into Kay's ear, "a nephew of Mrs. Grubach, and captain in the army, has been sleeping there since yesterday. There's no other room free." "I'd forgotten about it too. Why did you have to shout like that? You've made me quite upset." "There is no reason for it," said Kay, and, now as she sank back onto the cushion, kissed her forehead. Go away," she said, hurriedly sitting back up, "get out of here, go, what is it you want? He's listening at the door, he can hear everything. You're causing me so much trouble." "I won't go," said Kay, "until you've calmed down a bit. Come over into the other corner of the room, he won't be able to hear us there." She let him lead her there. "Don't forget," he said, "although this might be unpleasant for you, you're not in any real danger. You know how much esteem Mrs. Grubach has for me, she's the one who will make all the decisions in this, especially as the captain is her nephew, but she believes everything I say without question. What's more, she has borrowed a large sum of money from me, and that makes her dependent on me. I will confirm whatever you say to explain our being here together, however inappropriate it might be, and I guarantee to make sure that Mrs. Grubach will not only say she believes the explanation in public, but will believe it truly and sincerely. You will have no need to consider me in any way. If you wish to let it be known that I have attacked you, then Mrs. Grubach will be informed of such, and she will believe it without even losing her trust in me. That's how much respect she has for me." Miss Burstner looked at the floor in front of her, quiet and a little sunk in on herself. "Why would Mrs. Grubach not believe that I've attacked you?" added Kay. He looked at her hair in front of him, parted, bunched down, reddish and firmly held in place. He thought she would look up at him, but without changing her manner she said, "Forgive me, but it was the suddenness of the knocking that startled me so much, not so much what the consequences of the captain being here might be. It was all so quiet after you'd shouted, and then there was the knocking, that's what made me so shocked, and I was sitting right by the door, the knocking was right next to me. Thank you for your suggestions, but I won't accept them. I can bear the responsibility for anything that happens in my room myself, and I can do so with anyone. I'm surprised you don't realize just how insulting your suggestions are and what they imply about me, although I certainly acknowledge your good intentions. But now, please go, leave me alone, I need you to go now even more than I did earlier. The couple of minutes you asked for have grown into half an hour, more than half an hour now." Kay took hold of her hand, and then of her wrist. "You're not cross with me, though?" he said. She pulled her hand away and answered, "No, I'm never cross with anyone." He grasped her wrist once more, she tolerated it now and, in that way, lead him to the door. He had fully intended to leave. But when he reached the door he came to a halt as if he hadn't expected to find a door there. Miss Burstner made use of that moment to get herself free, open the door, slip out into the hallway, and gently say to Kay from there, "Now, come along, please. Look," she pointed to the captain's door, from under which there was a light shining. "He's put a light on, and he's laughing at us." "All right, I'm coming," said Kay, moved forward, took hold of her, kissed her on the mouth, and then over her whole face like a thirsty animal lapping with its tongue when it eventually finds water. He finally kissed her on her neck and her throat and left his lips pressed there for a long time. He did not look up until there was a noise from the captain's room. "I'll go now," he said. He wanted to address Miss Burstner by her Christian name, but did not know it. She gave him a tired nod, offered him her hand to kiss as she turned away, as if she did not know what she was doing, and went back into her room with her head bowed. A short while later, Kay was lying in his bed. He very soon went to sleep, but before he did he thought a little while about his behavior. He was satisfied with it, but felt some surprise that he was not more satisfied. He was seriously worried about Miss Burstner because of the captain. Chapter 2 First Cross-examination. Kay was informed by telephone that there would be a small hearing concerning his case the following Sunday. He was made aware that these cross-examinations would follow one another regularly, perhaps not every week but quite frequently. On the one hand, it was in everyone's interest to bring proceedings quickly to their conclusion, but on the other hand, every aspect of the examinations had to be carried out thoroughly without lasting too long because of the associated stress. For these reasons, it had been decided to hold a series of brief examinations following on one after another. Sunday had been chosen as the day for the hearings, so that Kay would not be disturbed in his professional work. It was assumed that he would be in agreement with this, but if he wished for another date then, as far as possible, he would be accommodated. Cross-examinations could even be held in the night, for instance, but Kay would probably not be fresh enough at that time. Anyway, as long as Kay made no objection, the hearing would be left on Sundays. It was a matter of course that he would have to appear without fail. There was probably no need to point this out to him. He would be given the number of the building where he was to present himself, which was in a street in a suburb well away from the city center, which Kay had never been to before. Once he had received this notice, Kay hung up the receiver without giving an answer. He had decided immediately to go there that Sunday. It was certainly necessary, proceedings had begun, and he had to face up to it, and this first examination would probably also be the last. He was still standing in thought by the telephone when he heard the voice of the deputy director behind him. He wanted to use the telephone, but Kay stood in his way. "Bad news?" asked the deputy director casually, not in order to find anything out, but just to get Kay away from the device. "No, no," said Kay. He stepped to one side but did not go away entirely. The deputy director picked up the receiver and, as he waited for his connection, turned away from it and said to Kay, "One question, Mr. Kay. Would you like to give me the pleasure of joining me on my sailing boat on Sunday morning? There's quite a few people coming, you're bound to know some of them. One of them is Hasterer, the state attorney. Would you like to come along? Do come along." Kay tried to pay attention to what the deputy director was saying. It was of no small importance for him, as this invitation from the deputy director, with whom he had never got on very well, meant that he was trying to improve his relations with him. It showed how important Kay had become in the bank, and how its second most important official seemed to value his friendship, or at least his impartiality. He was only speaking at the side of the telephone receiver while he waited for his connection, but in giving this invitation the deputy director was humbling himself. But Kay would have to humiliate him a second time as a result. He said, "Thank you very much, but I'm afraid I will have no time on Sunday, I have a previous obligation." "Pity," said the deputy director, and turned to the telephone conversation that had just been connected. It was not a short conversation, but Kay remained standing confused by the instrument all the time it was going on. It was only when the deputy director hung up that he was shocked into awareness and said, in order to partially excuse his standing there for no reason, "I've just received a telephone call, there's somewhere I need to go, but they forgot to tell me what time." "Ask them then," said the deputy director. "It's not that important," said Kay, although in that way his earlier excuse, already weak enough, was made even weaker. As he went, the deputy director continued to speak about other things. Kay forced himself to answer, but his thoughts were mainly about that Sunday, how it would be best to get there for 9 o'clock in the morning, as that was the time that courts always start work on weekdays. The weather was dull on Sunday. Kay was very tired, as he had stayed out drinking until late in the night celebrating with some of the regulars, and he had almost overslept. He dressed hurriedly, without the time to think and assemble the various plans he had worked out during the week. With no breakfast, he rushed to the suburb he had been told about. Oddly enough, although he had little time to look around him, he came across the 3 bank officials involved in his case, Rabensteiner, Kulik and Kaminer. The first 2 were traveling in a tram that went across Kay's route, but Kaminer sat on the terrace of a cafe and leant curiously over the wall as Kay came over. All of them seemed to be looking at him, surprised at seeing their superior running. It was a kind of pride that made Kay want to go on foot. This was his affair, and the idea of any help from strangers, however slight, was repulsive to him. He also wanted to avoid asking for anyone's help, because that would initiate them into the affair, even if only slightly. And after all, he had no wish at all to humiliate himself before the committee by being too punctual. Anyway, now he was running so that he would get there by 9 o'clock if at all possible, even though he had no appointment for this time. He had thought that he would recognize the building from a distance by some kind of sign, without knowing exactly what the sign would look like, or from some particular kind of activity outside the entrance. Kay had been told that the building was in Juliusstrasse, but when he stood at the street's entrance, it consisted on each side of almost nothing but monotonous gray constructions, tall blocks of flats occupied by poor people. Now, on a Sunday morning, most of the windows were occupied, men in their shirt sleeves leant out smoking, or carefully and gently held small children on the sills. Other windows were piled up with bedding, above which the disheveled head of a woman would briefly appear. People called out to each other across the street. One of the calls provoked a loud laugh about Kay himself. It was a long street, and spaced evenly along it were small shops below street level, selling various kinds of foodstuffs, which you reached by going down a few steps. Women went in and out of them or stood chatting on the steps. A fruitmonger, taking his goods up to the windows, was just as inattentive as Kay, and nearly knocked him down with his cart. Just then, a gramophone, which in better parts of town would have been seen as worn out, began to play some murderous tune. Kay went further into the street, slowly, as if he had plenty of time now, or as if the examining magistrate were looking at him from one of the windows, and therefore knew that Kay had found his way there. It was shortly after 9. The building was quite far down the street, it covered so much area it was almost extraordinary, and the gateway in particular was tall and long. It was clearly intended for delivery wagons belonging to the various warehouses all round the yard, which were now locked up, and carried the names of companies, some of which Kay knew from his work at the bank. In contrast with his usual habits, he remained standing a while at the entrance to the yard, taking in all these external details. Near him, there was a barefooted man sitting on a crate and reading a newspaper. There were 2 lads swinging on a hand cart. In front of a pump stood a weak, young girl in a bed jacket who, as the water flowed into her can, looked at Kay. There was a piece of rope stretched between 2 windows in a corner of the yard, with some washing hanging on it to dry. A man stood below it calling out instructions to direct the work being done. Kay went over to the stairway to get to the room where the hearing was to take place, but then stood still again, as besides these steps he could see 3 other stairway entrances, and there also seemed to be a small passageway at the end of the yard leading into a second yard. It irritated him that he had not been given more precise directions to the room. It meant they were either being especially neglectful with him or especially indifferent, and he decided to make that clear to them very loudly and very unambiguously. In the end he decided to climb up the stairs, his thoughts playing on something that he remembered the policeman, Willem, saying to him, that the court is attracted by the guilt, from which it followed that the courtroom must be on the stairway that Kay selected by chance. As he went up he disturbed a large group of children playing on the stairs who looked at him as he stepped through their rows. Next time I come here, he said to himself, I must either bring sweets with me, make them like me, or a stick to hit them with. Just before he reached the first landing he even had to wait a little while until a ball had finished its movement. 2 small lads with sly faces like grown-up scoundrels held him by his trouser legs until it had. If he were to shake them off he would have to hurt them, and he was afraid of what noise they would make by shouting. On the first floor, his search began for real. He still felt unable to ask for the investigating committee, and so he invented a joiner called Lanz. That name occurred to him because the captain, Mrs. Grubach's nephew, was called Lanz, so that he could ask at every flat whether Lanz the joiner lived there, and thus obtain a chance to look into the rooms. It turned out, though, that was mostly possible without further ado, as almost all the doors were left open and the children ran in and out. Most of them were small, one-windowed rooms where they also did the cooking. Many women held babies in one arm and worked at the stove with the other. Half-grown girls, who seemed to be dressed in just their pinafores, worked hardest running to and fro. In every room, the beds were still in use by people who were ill, or still asleep, or people stretched out on them in their clothes. Kay knocked at the flats where the doors were closed and asked whether Lanz the joiner lived there. It was usually a woman who opened the door, heard the enquiry, and turned to somebody in the room who would raise himself from the bed. The gentleman's asking if a joiner called Lanz lives here. A joiner called Lanz? He would ask from the bed. That's right, Kay would say, although it was clear that the investigating committee was not to be found there, and so his task was at an end. There were many who thought it must be very important for Kay to find Lanz the joiner and thought long about it, naming a joiner who was not called Lanz, or giving a name that had some vague similarity with Lanz, or they asked neighbors or accompanied Kay to a door a long way away, where they thought someone of that sort might live in the back part of the building, or where someone would be who could advise Kay better than they could themselves. Kay eventually had to give up asking if he did not want to be led all round from floor to floor in this way. He regretted his initial plan, which had at first seemed so practical to him. As he reached the 5th floor, he decided to give up the search, took his leave of a friendly young worker who wanted to lead him on still further, and went down the stairs. But then the thought of how much time he was wasting made him cross. He went back again and knocked at the first door on the 5th floor. The first thing he saw in this small room was a large clock on the wall which already showed 10 o'clock. "Is there a joiner called Lanz who lives here?" he asked. "Pardon?" said a young woman with black shining eyes who was, at that moment, washing children's underclothes in a bucket. She pointed her wet hand towards the open door of the adjoining room. Kay thought he had stepped into a meeting. A medium-sized, two-windowed room was filled with the most diverse crowd of people. Nobody paid any attention to the person who had just entered. Close under its ceiling, it was surrounded by a gallery which was also fully occupied, and where the people could only stand bent down with their heads and their backs touching the ceiling. Kay, who found the air too stuffy, stepped out again and said to the young woman, who had probably misunderstood what he had said, "I asked for a joiner, someone by the name of Lance." "Yes," said the woman, "please go on in." Kay would probably not have followed her if the woman had not gone up to him, taken hold of the door handle and said, "I'll have to close the door after you, no one else will be allowed in." "Very sensible," said Kay, "but it's too full already." But then he went back in anyway. He passed through between two men who were talking beside the door. One of them held both hands far out in front of himself, making the movements of counting out money. The other looked him closely in the eyes, and someone took him by the hand. It was a small, red-faced youth. Come in," he said. Kay let himself be led by him, and it turned out that there was surprisingly in a densely packed crowd of people moving to and fro, a narrow passage which may have been the division between two factions. This idea was reinforced by the fact that in the first few rows to the left and the right of him, there was hardly any face looking in his direction. He saw nothing but the backs of people directing their speech and their movements only towards members of their own side. Most of them were dressed in black, in old long formal frock coats that hung down loosely around them. These clothes were the only thing that puzzled Kay, as he would otherwise have taken the whole assembly for a local political meeting. At the other end of the hall where Kay had been led, there was a little table set at an angle on a very low podium, which was as overcrowded as everywhere else, and behind the table, near the edge of the podium, sat a small fat wheezing man who was talking with someone behind him. This second man was standing with his legs crossed and his elbows on the backrest of the chair, provoking much laughter. From time to time he threw his arm in the air as if doing a caricature of someone. The youth who was leading Kay had some difficulty in reporting to the man. He had already tried twice to tell him something, standing on tiptoe, but without getting the man's attention as he sat there above him. It was only when one of the people up on the podium drew his attention to the youth that the man turned to him and leant down to hear what it was he quietly said. Then he pulled out his watch and quickly looked over at Kay. "You should have been here 1 hour and 5 minutes ago," he said. Kay was going to give him a reply, but had no time to do so, as hardly had the man spoken than a general muttering arose all over the right-hand side of the hall. "You should have been here 1 hour and 5 minutes ago," the man now repeated, raising his voice this time, and quickly looked round the hall beneath him. The muttering also became immediately louder and, as the man said nothing more, died away only gradually. Now the hall was much quieter than when Kay had entered. Only the people up in the gallery had not stopped passing remarks. As far as could be distinguished, up in the half-darkness, dust and haze, they seemed to be less well-dressed than those below. Many of them had brought pillows that they had put between their heads and the ceiling, so that they would not hurt themselves pressed against it. Kay had decided he would do more watching than talking, so he did not defend himself for supposedly having come late, and simply said, "Well, maybe I have arrived late, I'm here now." There followed loud applause, once more from the right-hand side of the hall. Easy people to get on your side, thought Kay, and was bothered only by the quiet from the left-hand side which was directly behind him, and from which there was applause from only a few individuals. He wondered what he could say to get all of them to support him together, or, if that were not possible, to at least get the support of the others for a while. "Yes," said the man, "but I'm now no longer under any obligation to hear your case." There was once more a muttering, but this time it was misleading, as the man waved the people's objections aside with his hand and continued, "I will, however, as an exception, continue with it today. But you should never arrive late like this again. And now, step forward." Someone jumped down from the podium so that there would be a place free for Kay, and Kay stepped up onto it. He stood pressed closely against the table. The press of the crowd behind him was so great that he had to press back against it if he did not want to push the judge's desk down off the podium, and perhaps the judge along with it. The judge, however, paid no attention to that, but sat very comfortably on his chair and, after saying a few words to close his discussion with the man behind him, reached for a little notebook, the only item on his desk. It was like an old-school exercise book and had become quite misshapen from much thumbing. "Now then," said the judge, thumbing through the book. He turned to Kay with the tone of someone who knows his facts and said, "You are a house painter?" "No," said Kay, "I am the chief clerk in a large bank." This reply was followed by laughter among the right-hand faction down in the hall. It was so hearty that Kay couldn't stop himself joining in with it. The people supported themselves with their hands on their knees and shook as if suffering a serious attack of coughing. Even some of those in the gallery were laughing. The judge had become quite cross, but seemed to have no power over those below him in the hall. He tried to reduce what harm had been done in the gallery, and jumped up threatening them. His eyebrows, until then hardly remarkable, pushed themselves up and became big, black and bushy over his eyes. The left-hand side of the hall was still quiet, though. The people stood there in rows with their faces looking towards the podium, listening to what was being said there. They observed the noise from the other side of the hall with the same quietness, and even allowed some individuals from their own ranks, here and there, to go forward into the other faction. The people in the left faction were not only fewer in number than the right, but probably were no more important than them, although their behavior was calmer, and that made it seem like they were. When Kay now began to speak, he was convinced he was doing it in the same way as them. Your question, my lord, as to whether I am a house painter, in fact even more than that, you did not ask at all but merely imposed it on me, is symptomatic of the whole way these proceedings against me are being carried out. Perhaps you will object that there are no proceedings against me. You will be quite right, as there are proceedings only if I acknowledge that there are. But, for the moment, I do acknowledge it, out of pity for yourselves to a large extent. It's impossible not to observe all this business without feeling pity. I don't say things are being done without due care, but I would like to make it clear that it is I who make the acknowledgement. Kay stopped speaking and looked down into the hall. He had spoken sharply, more sharply than he had intended, but he had been quite right. It should have been rewarded with some applause here and there, but everything was quiet. They were all clearly waiting for what would follow. Perhaps the quietness was laying the ground for an outbreak of activity that would bring this whole affair to an end. It was somewhat disturbing that just then the door at the end of the hall opened. The young washerwoman, who seemed to have finished her work, came in and, despite all her caution, attracted the attention of some of the people there. It was only the judge who gave Kay any direct pleasure, as he seemed to have been immediately struck by Kay's words. Until then, he had listened to him standing, as Kay's speech had taken him by surprise, while he was directing his attention to the gallery. Now, in the pause, he sat down very slowly, as if he did not want anyone to notice. He took out the notebook again, probably so that he could give the impression of being calmer. That won't help you, sir, continued Kay. Even your little book will only confirm what I say. Kay was satisfied to hear nothing but his own quiet words in this room full of strangers, and he even dared casually to pick up the examining judge's notebook and, touching it only with the tips of his fingers, as if it were something revolting, lifted it in the air, holding it just by one of the middle pages, so that the others on each side of it, closely written, blotted and yellowing, flapped down. Those are the official notes of the examining judge, he said, and let the notebook fall down onto the desk. You can read in your book as much as you like, sir. I really don't have anything in this charge book to be afraid of, even though I don't have access to it, as I wouldn't want it in my hand. I can only touch it with 2 fingers. The judge grabbed the notebook from where it had fallen on the desk, which could only have been a sign of his deep humiliation, or at least that is how it must have been perceived, tried to tidy it up a little, and held it once more in front of himself in order to read from it. The people in the front row looked up at him, showing such tension on their faces that he looked back down at them for some time. Every one of them was an old man, some of them with white beards. Could they perhaps be the crucial group who could turn the whole assembly one way or the other? They had sunk into a state of motionlessness while Kay gave his oration, and it had not been possible to raise them from this passivity, even when the judge was being humiliated. What has happened to me, continued Kay, with less of the vigor he had had earlier. He continually scanned the faces in the first row, and this gave his address a somewhat nervous and distracted character. What has happened to me is not just an isolated case. If it were, it would not be of much importance, as it's not of much importance to me, but it is a symptom of proceedings which are carried out against many. It's on behalf of them that I stand here now, not for myself alone. Without having intended it, he had raised his voice. Somewhere in the hall, someone raised his hands and applauded him, shouting, "Bravo!" Why not then? Bravo! Again I say, bravo! Some of the men in the first row groped around in their beards. None of them looked round to see who was shouting. Not even Kay thought him of any importance, but it did raise his spirits. He no longer thought it at all necessary that all of those in the hall should applaud him. It was enough if the majority of them began to think about the matter, and if only one of them, now and then, was persuaded. "I'm not trying to be a successful orator," said Kay after this thought. "That's probably more than I'm capable of anyway. I'm sure the examining judge can speak far better than I can. It is part of his job after all. All that I want is a public discussion of a public wrong. Listen. 10 days ago I was placed under arrest. The arrest itself is something I laugh about, but that's beside the point. They came for me in the morning when I was still in bed. Maybe the order had been given to arrest some house painter. That seems possible after what the judge has said, someone who is as innocent as I am, but it was me they chose. There were 2 police thugs occupying the next room. They could not have taken better precautions if I had been a dangerous robber. And these policemen were unprincipled riff-raff. They talked at me till I was sick of it. They wanted bribes. They wanted to trick me into giving them my clothes. They wanted money, supposedly so that they could bring me my breakfast, after they had blatantly eaten my own breakfast in front of my eyes. And even that was not enough. I was led in front of the supervisor in another room. This was the room of a lady who I have a lot of respect for, and I was forced to look on while the supervisor and the policeman made quite a mess of this room because of me, although not through any fault of mine. It was not easy to stay calm, but I managed to do so and was completely calm when I asked the supervisor why it was that I was under arrest. If he were here he would have to confirm what I say. I can see him now, sitting on the chair belonging to that lady I mentioned, a picture of dull-witted arrogance. What do you think he answered? What he told me, gentlemen, was basically nothing at all. Perhaps he really did know nothing. He had placed me under arrest and was satisfied. In fact, he had done more than that and brought 3 junior employees from the bank where I work into the lady's room. They had made themselves busy interfering with some photographs that belonged to the lady and causing a mess. There was, of course, another reason for bringing these employees. They, just like my landlady and her maid, were expected to spread the news of my arrest and damage my public reputation, and in particular to remove me from my position at the bank. Well, they didn't succeed in any of that, not in the slightest. Even my landlady, who is quite a simple person, and I will give you here her name in full respect, her name is Mrs. Grubach. Even Mrs. Grubach was understanding enough to see that an arrest like this has no more significance than an attack carried out on the street by some youths who are not kept under proper control. I repeat, this whole affair has caused me nothing but unpleasantness and temporary irritation, but could it not also have had some far worse consequences? Kay broke off here and looked at the judge, who said nothing. As he did so, he thought he saw the judge use a movement of his eyes to give a sign to someone in the crowd. Kay smiled and said, "And now the judge, right next to me, is giving a secret sign to someone among you. There seems to be someone among you who is taking directions from above. I don't know whether the sign is meant to produce booing or applause, but I'll resist trying to guess what its meaning is too soon. It really doesn't matter to me, and I give His Lordship the judge my full and public permission to stop giving secret signs to his paid subordinate down there, and give his orders in words instead. Let him just say boo now, and then the next time clap now." Whether it was embarrassment or impatience, the judge rocked backwards and forwards on his seat. The man behind him, whom he had been talking with earlier, leant forward again, either to give him a few general words of encouragement or some specific piece of advice. Below them in the hall the people talked to each other quietly but animatedly. The 2 factions had earlier seemed to hold views strongly opposed to each other, but now they began to intermingle. A few individuals pointed up at Kay, others pointed at the judge. The air in the room was foggy and extremely oppressive. Those who were standing furthest away could hardly even be seen through it. It must have been especially troublesome for those visitors who were in the gallery, as they were forced to quietly ask the participants in the assembly what exactly was happening, albeit with timid glances at the judge. The replies they received were just as quiet and given behind the protection of a raised hand. "I have nearly finished what I have to say," said Kay, and as there was no bell available, he struck the desk with his fist in a way that startled the judge and his advisor and made them look up from each other. "None of this concerns me, and I am therefore able to make a calm assessment of it, and, assuming that this so-called court is of any real importance, it will be very much to your advantage to listen to what I have to say. If you want to discuss what I say, please don't bother to write it down until later on. I don't have any time to waste, and I'll soon be leaving." There was immediate silence, which showed how well Kay was in control of the crowd. There were no shouts among them as there had been at the start, no one even applauded, but if they weren't already persuaded they seemed very close to it. Kay was pleased at the tension among all the people there as they listened to him. A rustling rose from the silence which was more invigorating than the most ecstatic applause could have been. There is no doubt, he said quietly, that there is some enormous organization determining what is said by this court. In my case, this includes my arrest and the examination taking place here today. An organization that employs policemen who can be bribed, office supervisors and judges, of whom nothing better can be said than that they are not as arrogant as some others. This organization even maintains a high-level judiciary, along with its train of countless servants, scribes, policemen and all the other assistants that it needs, perhaps even executioners and torturers. I'm not afraid of using those words. And what, gentlemen, is the purpose of this enormous organization? Its purpose is to arrest innocent people and wage pointless prosecutions against them, which, as in my case, lead to no result. How are we to avoid those in office becoming deeply corrupt when everything is devoid of meaning? That is impossible. Not even the highest judge would be able to achieve that for himself. That is why policemen try to steal the clothes off the back of those they arrest. That is why supervisors break into the homes of people they do not know. That is why innocent people are humiliated in front of crowds, rather than being given a proper trial. The policemen only talked about the warehouses where they put the property of those they arrest. I would like to see these warehouses where the hard-won possessions of people under arrest is left to decay, if, that is, it's not stolen by the thieving hands of the warehouse workers. Kay was interrupted by a screeching from the far end of the hall. He shaded his eyes to see that far, as the dull light of day made the smoke whitish and hard to see through. It was the washerwoman whom Kay had recognized as a likely source of disturbance as soon as she had entered. It was hard to see now whether it was her fault or not. Kay could only see that a man had pulled her into a corner by the door and was pressing himself against her. But it was not her who was screaming, but the man. He had opened his mouth wide and looked up at the ceiling. A small circle had formed around the two of them. The visitors near him in the gallery seemed delighted that the serious tone Kay had introduced into the gathering had been disturbed in this way. Kay's first thought was to run over there, and he also thought that everyone would want to bring things back into order there, or at least to make the pair leave the room, but the first row of people in front of him stayed where they were. No one moved, and no one let Kay through. On the contrary, they stood in his way. Old men held out their arms in front of him, and a hand from somewhere he did not have the time to turn round took hold of his collar. Kay, by this time, had forgotten about the pair. It seemed to him that his freedom was being limited, as if his arrest was being taken seriously, and, without any thought for what he was doing, he jumped down from the podium. Now he stood face to face with the crowd. Had he judged the people properly? Had he put too much faith in the effect of his speech? Had they been putting up a pretense all the time he had been speaking, and now that he come to the end and to what must follow, were they tired of pretending? What faces they were, all around him! Dark, little eyes flickered here and there, cheeks drooped down like on drunken men, their long beards were thin and stiff. If they took hold of them, it was more like they were making their hands into claws, not as if they were taking hold of their own beards. But underneath those beards, and this was the real discovery made by Kay, there were badges of various sizes and colors, shining on the collars of their coats. As far as he could see, every one of them was wearing one of these badges. All of them belonged to the same group, even though they seemed to be divided to the right and the left of him, and when he suddenly turned round he saw the same badge on the collar of the examining judge, who calmly looked down at him with his hands in his lap. So called out Kay, throwing his arms in the air as if this sudden realization needed more room. All of you are working for this organization. I see now that you are all the very bunch of cheats and liars I've just been speaking about. You've all pressed yourselves in here in order to listen in and snoop on me. You gave the impression of having formed into factions. One of you even applauded me to test me out, and you wanted to learn how to trap an innocent man. Well, I hope you haven't come here for nothing. I hope you've either had some fun from someone who expected you to defend his innocence, or else let go of me, or I'll hit you, shouted Kay to a quivery old man who had pressed himself especially close to him, or else that you've actually learned something. And so I wish you good luck in your trade. He briskly took his hat from where it lay on the edge of the table, and, surrounded by a silence caused perhaps by the completeness of their surprise, pushed his way to the exit. However, the examining judge seems to have moved even more quickly than Kay, as he was waiting for him at the doorway. "One moment," he said. Kay stood where he was, but looked at the door with his hand already on its handle, rather than at the judge. "I merely wanted to draw your attention," said the judge, "to something you seem not yet to be aware of. Today, you have robbed yourself of the advantages that a hearing of this sort always gives to someone who is under arrest." Kay laughed towards the door. "You bunch of louts," he called, "you can keep all your hearings as a present from me. then opened the door and hurried down the steps. Behind him, the noise of the assembly rose as it became lively once more, and probably began to discuss these events, as if making a scientific study of them. Chapter 3. In the empty courtroom, the offices every day over the following week, Kay expected another summons to arrive. He could not believe that his rejection of any more hearings had been taken literally, and when the expected summons really had not come by Saturday evening, he took it to mean that he was expected, without being told, to appear at the same place at the same time. So on Sunday, he set out once more in the same direction, going without hesitation up the steps and through the corridors. Some of the people remembered him and greeted him from their doorways, but he no longer needed to ask anyone the way, and soon arrived at the right door. It was opened as soon as he knocked and, paying no attention to the woman he had seen last time who was standing at the doorway, he was about to go straight into the adjoining room when she said to him, "There's no session today." "What do you mean, no session?" he asked, unable to believe it. But the woman persuaded him by opening the door to the next room. It was indeed empty, and looked even more dismal empty than it had the previous Sunday. On the podium stood the table exactly as it had been before, with a few books laying on it. "Can I have a look at those books?" asked Kay, not because he was especially curious, but so that he would not have come for nothing. "No," said the woman as she reclosed the door, "that's not allowed. Those books belong to the examining judge." "I see," said Kay, and nodded. "Those books must be law books, and that's how this court does things, not only to try people who are innocent, but even to try them without letting them know what's going on." "I expect you're right," said the woman, who had not understood exactly what he meant. "I'd better go away again, then," said Kay. "Should I give a message to the examining judge?" asked the woman. "Do you know him, then?" asked Kay. "Of course I know him," said the woman. "My husband is the court usher." It was only now that Kay noticed that the room, which before had held nothing but a washtub, had been fitted out as a living room. The woman saw how surprised he was and said, "Yes, we're allowed to live here as we like, only we have to clear the room out when the court's in session. There's lots of disadvantages to my husband's job." "It's not so much the room that surprises me," said Kay, looking at her crossly. "It's your being married that shocks me. Are you thinking about what happened last time the court was in session, when I disturbed what you were saying?" asked the woman. "Of course," said Kay, "it's in the past now and I've nearly forgotten about it, but at the time it made me furious. And now you tell me yourself that you are a married woman. It wasn't any disadvantage for you to have your speech interrupted. The way they talked about you after you'd gone was really bad." "That could well be," said Kay, turning away, "but it does not excuse you." "There's no one I know who'd hold it against me," said the woman. "Him, who put his arms around me, he's been chasing after me for a long time. I might not be very attractive for most people, but I am for him. I've got no protection from him, even my husband has had to get used to it. If he wants to keep his job, he's got to put up with it, as that man's a student, and he'll almost certainly be very powerful later on. He's always after me, he'd only just left when you arrived." "That fits in with everything else," said Kay. "I'm not surprised. Do you want to make things a bit better here?" the woman asked slowly, watching him as if she were saying something that could be as dangerous for Kay as for herself. "That's what I thought when I heard you speak. I really liked what you said. Mind you, I only heard part of it, I missed the beginning of it, and at the end I was lying on the floor with the student. It's so horrible here," she said after a pause, and took hold of Kay's hand. "Do you believe you really will be able to make things better?" Kay smiled and twisted his hand round a little in her soft hands. "It's really not my job to make things better here, as you put it," he said, "and if you said that to the examining judge, he would laugh at you or punish you for it. I really would not have become involved in this matter if I could have helped it, and I would have lost no sleep worrying about how this court needs to be made better. But because I'm told that I have been arrested and I am under arrest, it forces me to take some action, and to do so for my own sake. However, if I can be of some service to you in the process, I will, of course, be glad to do so. And I will be glad to do so not only for the sake of charity, but also because you can be of some help to me." "How could I help you, then?" said the woman. "You could, for example, show me the books on the table there." "Yes, certainly," the woman cried, and pulled Kay along behind her as she rushed to them. The books were old and well worn, the cover of one of them had nearly broken through in its middle, and it was held together with a few threads. "Everything is so dirty here," said Kay, shaking his head, and before he could pick the books up the woman wiped some of the dust off with her apron. Kay took hold of the book that lay on top and threw it open. An indecent picture appeared. A man and a woman sat naked on a sofa. The base intent of whoever drew it was easy to see, but he had been so grossly lacking in skill that all that anyone could really make out were the man and the woman who dominated the picture with their bodies, sitting in overly upright postures that created a false perspective and made it difficult for them to approach each other. Kay didn't thumb through that book anymore, but just drew open the next one at its title page. It was a novel with the title, What Greed Suffered from Her Husband, Hans. "So this is the sort of law book they study here," said Kay. "This is the sort of person sitting in judgment over me." "I can help you," said the woman. "Would you like me to? Could you really do that without placing yourself in danger? You did say earlier on that your husband is wholly dependent on his superiors." "I still want to help you," said the woman. "Come over here, we've got to talk about it. Don't say any more about what danger I'm in. I only fear danger where I want to fear it. Come over here." She pointed to the podium and invited him to sit down on the step with her. "You've got lovely dark eyes," she said after they had sat down, looking up into Kay's face. "People say I've got nice eyes too, but yours are much nicer. It was the first thing I noticed when you first came here. That's even why I came in here, into the assembly room, afterwards. I'd never normally do that, I'm not really even allowed to." "So that's what all this is about," thought Kay. "She's offering herself to me. She's as degenerate as everything else around here. She's had enough of the court officials, which is understandable, I suppose, and so she approaches any stranger and makes compliments about his eyes." With that, Kay stood up in silence as if he had spoken his thoughts out loud and thus explained his action to the woman. "I don't think you can be of any assistance to me," he said. "To be of any real assistance you would need to be in contact with high officials. But I'm sure you only know the lower employees, and there are crowds of them milling about here. I'm sure you're very familiar with them and could achieve a great deal through them, I've no doubt of that, but the most that could be done through them would have no bearing at all on the final outcome of the trial. You, on the other hand, would lose some of your friends as a result, and I have no wish of that. Carry on with these people in the same way as you have been, as it does seem to me to be something you cannot do without. I have no regrets in saying this as, in return for your compliment to me, I also find you rather attractive, especially when you look at me as sadly as you are now, although you really have no reason to do so. You belong to the people I have to combat, and you're very comfortable among them. You're even in love with the student, or if you don't love him, you do at least prefer him to your husband. It's easy to see that from what you've been saying." "No," she shouted, remained sitting where she was and grasped Kay's hand, which he failed to pull away fast enough. "You can't go away now, you can't go away when you've misjudged me like that. Are you really capable of going away now? Am I really so worthless that you won't even do me the favor of staying a little bit longer?" "You misunderstand me," said Kay, sitting back down. "If it's really important to you for me to stay here, then I'll be glad to do so. I have plenty of time. I came here thinking there would be a trial taking place. All I meant with what I said just now was to ask you not to do anything on my behalf in the proceedings against me. But even that is nothing for you to worry about when you consider that there's nothing hanging on the outcome of this trial, and that, whatever the verdict, I will just laugh at it. And that's even presupposing it ever even reaches any conclusion, which I very much doubt. I think it's much more likely that the court officials will be too lazy, too forgetful, or even too fearful ever to continue with these proceedings, and that they will soon be abandoned if they haven't been abandoned already. It's even possible that they will pretend to be carrying on with the trial in the hope of receiving a large bribe, although I can tell you now that that will be quite in vain as I pay bribes to no one. Perhaps one favor you could do me would be to tell the examining judge, or anyone else who likes to spread important news, that I will never be induced to pay any sort of bribe through any stratagem of theirs, and I'm sure they have many stratagems at their disposal. There is no prospect of that, you can tell them that quite openly. And what's more, I expect they have already noticed themselves, or even if they haven't, this affair is really not so important to me as they think. Those gentlemen would only save some work for themselves, or at least some unpleasantness for me, which, however, I am glad to endure if I know that each piece of unpleasantness for me is a blow against them. And I will make quite sure it is a blow against them. Do you actually know the judge?" "Course I do," said the woman. "He was the first one I thought of when I offered to help you. I didn't know he's only a minor official, but if you say so it must be true. Mind you, I still think the report he gives to his superiors must have some influence. And he writes so many reports. You say these officials are lazy, but they're certainly not all lazy, especially this examining judge, he writes ever such a lot. Last Sunday, for instance, that session went on till the evening. Everyone had gone, but the examining judge, he stayed in the hall. I had to bring him a lamp in. All I had was a little kitchen lamp, but he was very satisfied with it and started to write straight away. Meantime my husband arrived. He always has the day off on Sundays. We got the furniture back in and got our room sorted out, and then a few of the neighbors came. We sat and talked for a bit by a candle. In short, we forgot all about the examining judge and went to bed. There's the examining judge shading the lamp with his hand so that there's no light from it falls on my husband. He didn't need to be as careful as that. The way my husband sleeps, the light wouldn't have woken him up anyway. I was quite shocked and nearly screamed, but the judge was very friendly, warned me I should be careful. He whispered to me he's been writing all this time, and now he's brought me the lamp back, and he'll never forget how I looked when he found me there asleep. What I mean, with all this, I just wanted to tell you how the examining judge really does write lots of reports, especially about you, as questioning you is definitely one of the main things on the agenda that Sunday. If he writes reports, as long as that they must be of some importance. And besides all that, you can see from what happened that the examining judge is after me, and it's right now, when he's first begun to notice me, that I can have a lot of influence on him. And I've got other proof I mean a lot to him, too. Yesterday, he sent that student to me, the one he really trusts and who he works with. He sent him with a present for me, silk stockings. He said it was because I clear up in the courtroom, but that's only a pretense. That job's no more than what I'm supposed to do. It's what my husband gets paid for. Nice stockings they are. Look, she stretched out her leg, drew her skirt up to her knee, and looked, herself, at the stocking. They are nice stockings, but they're too good for me, really. She suddenly interrupted herself and laid her hand on Kay's, as if she wanted to calm him down, and whispered, "Be quiet, Berthold is watching us." Kay slowly looked up. In the doorway to the courtroom stood a young man. He was short, his legs were not quite straight, and he continually moved his finger round in a short, thin, red beard, with which he hoped to make himself look dignified. Kay looked at him with some curiosity. He was the first student he had ever met of the unfamiliar discipline of jurisprudence, face to face at least, a man who would even most likely attain high office one day. The student, in contrast, seemed to take no notice of Kay at all. He merely withdrew his finger from his beard long enough to beckon to the woman and went over to the window. The woman leant over to Kay and whispered, "Don't be cross with me, please don't, and please don't think ill of me either. I've got to go to him now, to this horrible man. Just look at his bent legs. But I'll come straight back and then I'll go with you if you'll take me. I'll go wherever you want. You can do whatever you like with me. I'll be happy if I can be away from here for as long as possible. It'd be best if I could get away from here for good." She stroked Kay's hand once more, jumped up and ran over to the window. Before he realized it, Kay grasped for her hand but failed to catch it. He really was attracted to the woman, and even after thinking hard about it could find no good reason why he should not give in to her allure. It briefly crossed his mind that the woman meant to entrap him on behalf of the court, but that was an objection he had no difficulty in fending off. In what way could she entrap him? Was he not still free, so free that he could crush the entire court whenever he wanted, at least where it concerned him? Could he not have that much confidence in himself? And her offer of help sounded sincere, and maybe it wasn't quite worthless. And maybe there was no better revenge against the examining judge and his cronies than to take this woman from him and have her for himself. Maybe then, after much hard work writing dishonest reports about Kay, the judge would go to the woman's bed late one night and find it empty. And it would be empty because she belonged to Kay, because this woman at the window, this lush, supple, warm body in its somber clothes of rough, heavy material belonged to him, totally to him and to him alone. Once he had settled his thoughts towards the woman in this way, he began to find the quiet conversation at the window was taking too long. He rapped on the podium with his knuckles, and then even with his fist. The student briefly looked away from the woman to glance at Kay over his shoulder, but did allow himself to be disturbed. In fact, he even pressed himself close to the woman and put his arms around her. She dropped her head down low, as if listening to him carefully. As she did so, he kissed her right on the neck, hardly even interrupting what he was saying. Kay saw this as confirmation of the tyranny the student held over the woman, and which she had already complained about. He stood up and walked up and down the room. Glancing sideways at the student, he wondered what would be the quickest possible way to get rid of him, and so it was not unwelcome to him when the student, clearly disturbed by Kay's to-ing and fro-ing, which Kay had now developed into a stamping up and down, said to him, "You don't have to stay here, you know, if you're getting impatient. You could have gone earlier, no one would have missed you." In fact, you should have gone. You should have left as quickly as possible as soon as I got here." This comment could have caused all possible rage to break out between them, but Kay also bore in mind that this was a prospective court official speaking to a disfavored defendant, and he might well have been taking pride in speaking in this way. Kay remained standing quite close to him and said with a smile, "You're quite right, I am impatient, but the easiest way to settle this impatience would be if you left us. On the other hand, if you've come here to study, you're a student, I hear I'll be quite happy to leave the room to you and go away with the woman. I'm sure you still have a lot of study to do before you're made into a judge. It's true that I'm still not all that familiar with your branch of jurisprudence, but I take it involves a lot more than speaking roughly, and I see you have no shame in doing that extremely well." "He shouldn't have been allowed to move about so freely," said the student, as if he wanted to give the woman an explanation for Kay's insults. "That was a mistake. I've told the examining judge so. He should at least have been detained in his room between hearings. Sometimes it's impossible to understand what the judge thinks he's doing." "You're wasting your breath," said Kay. Then he reached his hand out towards the woman and said, "Come with me." "So that's it," said the student. "Oh no, you're not going to get her," and with a strength you would not have expected from him, he glanced tenderly at her, lifted her up on one arm, and, his back bent under the weight, ran with her to the door. In this way he showed, unmistakably, that he was to some extent afraid of Kay, but he nonetheless dared to provoke him still further by stroking and squeezing the woman's arm with his free hand. Kay ran the few steps up to him, but when he had reached him and was about to take hold of him and, if necessary, throttle him, the woman said, "It's no good, it's the examining judge who sent for me. I daren't go with you, this little bastard," and here she ran her hand over the student's face. "This little bastard won't let me." "And you don't want to be set free?" shouted Kay, laying his hand on the student's shoulder, who then snapped at it with his teeth. "No," shouted the woman, pushing Kay away with both hands. "No, no, don't do that. What do you think you're doing? That'd be the end of me. Let go of him, please, just let go of him. He's only carrying out the judge's orders, he's carrying me to him. Let him take you then, and I want to see nothing more of you," said Kay, enraged by his disappointment in giving the student a thump in the back, so that he briefly stumbled and then, glad that he had not fallen, immediately jumped up all the higher with his burden. Kay followed them slowly. He realized that this was the first unambiguous setback he had suffered from these people. It was of course nothing to worry about, he accepted the setback only because he was looking for a fight. If he stayed at home and carried on with his normal life, he would be 1,000 times superior to these people and could get any of them out of his way just with a kick. And he imagined the most laughable scene possible as an example of this: if this contemptible student, this inflated child, this knock-kneed Redbeard, if he were kneeling at Elsa's bed wringing his hands and begging for forgiveness. Kay so enjoyed imagining this scene that he decided to take the student along to Elsa with him, if ever he should get the opportunity. Kay was curious to see where the woman would be taken, and he hurried over to the door. The student was not likely to carry her through the streets on his arm. It turned out that the journey was far shorter. Directly opposite the flat there was a narrow flight of wooden steps which probably led up to the attic. They turned as they went, so that it was not possible to see where they ended. The student carried the woman up these steps, and after the exertions of running with her, he was soon groaning and moving very slowly. The woman waved down at Kay, and by raising and lowering her shoulders, she tried to show that she was an innocent party in this abduction, although the gesture did not show a lot of regret. Kay watched her without expression like a stranger. He wanted to show neither that he was disappointed, nor that he would easily get over his disappointment. The two of them had disappeared, but Kay remained standing in the doorway. He had to accept that the woman had not only cheated him, but that she had also lied to him when she said she was being taken to the examining judge. The examining judge certainly wouldn't be sitting and waiting in the attic. The wooden stairs would explain nothing to him however long he stared at them. Then Kay noticed a small piece of paper next to them, went across to it and read, in a childish and unpracticed hand, "Entrance to the court offices." Were the court offices here, in the attic of this tenement, then? If that was how they were accommodated, it did not attract much respect, and it was some comfort for the accused to realize how little money this court had at its disposal if it had to locate its offices in a place where the tenants of the building, who were themselves among the poorest of people, would throw their unneeded junk. On the other hand, it was possible that the officials had enough money, but that they squandered it on themselves rather than use it for the court's purposes. Going by Kay's experience of them so far, that even seemed probable. except that if the court were allowed to decay in that way, it would not just humiliate the accused, but also give him more encouragement than if the court were simply in a state of poverty. Kay also now understood that the court was ashamed to summon those it accused to the attic of this building for the initial hearing, and why it preferred to impose upon them in their own homes. What a position it was that Kay found himself in, compared with the judge sitting up in the attic. Kay, at the bank, had a big office with an anteroom, and had an enormous window through which he could look down at the activity in the square. It was true, though, that he had no secondary income from bribes and fraud, and he couldn't tell a servant to bring him a woman up to the office on his arm. Kay, however, was quite willing to do without such things, in this life at least. Kay was still looking at the notice when a man came up the stairs, looked through the open door into the living room where it was also possible to see the courtroom, and finally asked Kay whether he had just seen a woman there. "You're the court usher, aren't you?" asked Kay. "That's right," said the man. "Oh, yes, you're defendant Kay, I recognize you now as well. Nice to see you here." And he offered Kay his hand, which was far from what Kay had expected. And when Kay said nothing, he added, "There's no court session planned for today, though." "I know that," said Kay as he looked at the usher's civilian coat which, beside its ordinary buttons, displayed two gilded ones as the only sign of his office, and seemed to have been taken from an old army officer's coat. "I was speaking with your wife a little while ago. She is no longer here. The student has carried her off to the examining judge." "Listen to this," said the usher, "they're always carrying her away from me. It's Sunday today, and it's not part of my job to do any work today, but they send me off with some message which isn't even necessary just to get me away from here. What they do is they send me off not too far away, so that I can still hope to get back on time if I really hurry. So off I go running as fast as I can, shout the message through the crack in the door of the office I've been sent to, so out of breath they'll hardly be able to understand it, run back here again, but the student's been even faster than I have. Well, he's got less far to go, he's only got to run down the steps. If I wasn't so dependent on them I'd have squashed the student against the wall here a long time ago. Right here, next to the sign. I'm always dreaming of doing that. Just here, just above the floor, that's where he's crushed onto the wall, his arms stretched out, his fingers spread apart, his crooked legs twisted round into a circle, and blood squirted out all around him. It's only ever been a dream so far, though. Is there nothing else you do?" asked Kay with a smile. "Nothing that I know of," said the usher. "And it's going to get even worse now. Up till now he's only been carrying her off for himself, now he's started carrying her off for the judge and all, just like I'd always said he would." "Does your wife, then, not share some of the responsibility?" asked Kay. He had to force himself as he asked this question, as he too felt so jealous now. "Course she does," said the usher. "It's more her fault than theirs. It was her who attached herself to him. All he did, he just chases after any woman. There's 5 flats in this block alone, where he's been thrown out after working his way in there. And my wife is the best looking woman in the whole building, but it's me who's not even allowed to defend himself. If that's how things are, then there's nothing that can be done," said Kay. "Well, why not?" asked the usher. "He's a coward, that student. If he wants to lay a finger on my wife all you'd have to do is give him such a good hiding he'd never dare do it again. But I'm not allowed to do that, and nobody else is going to do me the favor as they're all afraid of his power. The only one who could do it is a man like you." "What, how could I do it?" asked Kay in astonishment. "Well, you're facing a charge, aren't you?" said the usher. "Yes, but that's all the more reason for me to be afraid. Even if he has no influence on the outcome of the trial, he probably has some on the initial examination." "Yes, exactly," said the usher, as if Kay's view had been just as correct as his own. "Only we don't usually get any trials heard here with no hope at all." "I am not of the same opinion," said Kay, "although that ought not to prevent me from dealing with the student if the opportunity arises." "I would be very grateful to you," said the usher of the court, somewhat formally, not really seeming to believe that his highest wish could be fulfilled. "Perhaps," continued Kay, "perhaps there are some other officials of yours here, perhaps all of them, who would deserve the same." "Oh yes, yes," said the usher, as if this was a matter of course. Then he looked at Kay trustingly, which, despite all his friendliness, he had not done until then, and added, "They're always rebelling." But the conversation seemed to have become a little uncomfortable for him, as he broke it off by saying, "Now I have to report to the office. Would you like to come with me?" "There's nothing for me to do there," said Kay. "You'd be able to have a look at it. No one will take any notice of you." Is it worth seeing then? Asked Kay hesitatingly, although he felt very keen to go with him. Well, said the usher, I thought you'd be interested in it. All right then, said Kay finally, I'll come with you. And, quicker than the usher himself, he ran up the steps. At the entrance he nearly fell over, as behind the door there was another step. They don't show much concern for the public, he said. They don't show any concern at all, said the usher, just look at the waiting room here. It consisted of a long corridor from which roughly made doors led out to the separate departments of the attic. There was no direct source of light, but it was not entirely dark as many of the departments, instead of solid walls, had just wooden bars reaching up to the ceiling to separate them from the corridor. The light made its way in through them, and it was also possible to see individual officials through them as they sat writing at their desks or stood up at the wooden frameworks and watched the people on the corridor through the gaps. There were only a few people in the corridor, probably because it was Sunday. They were not very impressive. They sat, equally spaced, on 2 rows of long wooden benches, which had been placed along both sides of the corridor. All of them were carelessly dressed, although the expressions on their faces, their bearing, the style of their beards and many details which were hard to identify, showed that they belonged to the upper classes. There were no coat hooks for them to use, and so they had placed their hats under the bench, each probably having followed the example of the others. When those who were sitting nearest the door saw Kay and the usher of the court, they stood up to greet them, and when the others saw that, they also thought they had to greet them, so that as the two of them went by all the people there stood up. None of them stood properly upright, their backs were bowed, their knees bent, they stood like beggars on the street. Kay waited for the usher, who was following just behind him. They must all be very dispirited, he said. Yes, said the usher, they are the accused, everyone you see here has been accused. Really? Said Kay. They're colleagues of mine then. And he turned to the nearest one, a tall thin man with hair that was nearly gray. What is it you're waiting for here? Asked Kay, politely, but the man was startled at being spoken to unexpectedly, which was all the more pitiful to see, because the man clearly had some experience of the world and elsewhere would certainly have been able to show his superiority and would not have easily given up the advantage he had acquired. Here, though, he did not know what answer to give to such a simple question and looked round at the others as if they were under some obligation to help him and as if no one could expect any answer from him without this help. Then the usher of the court stepped forward to him and, in order to calm him down and raise his spirits, said, "The gentleman here is only asking what it is you're waiting for. You can give him an answer." The voice of the usher was probably familiar to him and had a better effect than Kay's. I'm waiting," he began, and then came to a halt. He had clearly chosen this beginning so that he could give a precise answer to the question, but now he didn't know how to continue. Some of the others waiting had come closer and stood round the group. The usher of the court said to them, "Get out the way, keep the gangway free." They moved back slightly, but not as far as where they had been sitting before. In the meantime, the man whom Kay had first approached had pulled himself together and even answered him with a smile. "A month ago I made some applications for evidence to be heard in my case, and I'm waiting for it to be settled." "You certainly seem to be going to a lot of effort," said Kay. "Yes," said the man, "it is my affair after all." "Not everyone thinks the same way as you do," said Kay. "I've been indicted as well, but I swear on my soul that I've neither submitted evidence nor done anything else of the sort." "Do you really think that's necessary?" "I don't really know, exactly," said the man, once more totally unsure of himself. He clearly thought Kay was joking with him, and therefore probably thought it best to repeat his earlier answer in order to avoid making any new mistakes. With Kay looking at him impatiently, he just said, "As far as I'm concerned, I've applied to have this evidence heard." "Perhaps you don't believe I've been indicted?" asked Kay. "Oh, please, I certainly do," said the man, stepping slightly to one side, but there was more anxiety in his answer than belief. "You don't believe me then?" asked Kay, and took hold of his arm, unconsciously prompted by the man's humble demeanor, and as if he wanted to force him to believe him. But he did not want to hurt the man, and had only taken hold of him very lightly. Nonetheless, the man cried out as if Kay had grasped him not with 2 fingers, but with red-hot tongues. Shouting in this ridiculous way finally made Kay tired of him. If he didn't believe he was indicted, then so much the better. Maybe he even thought Kay was a judge. And before leaving, he held him a lot harder, shoved him back onto the bench and walked on. "These defendants are so sensitive, most of them," said the usher of the court. Almost all of those who had been waiting had now assembled around the man who, by now, had stopped shouted, and they seemed to be asking him lots of precise questions about the incident. Kay was approached by a security guard, identifiable mainly by his sword, of which the scabbard seemed to be made of aluminium. This greatly surprised Kay, and he reached out for it with his hand. The guard had come because of the shouting and asked what had been happening. The usher of the court said a few words to try and calm him down, but the guard explained that he had to look into it himself, saluted, and hurried on, walking with very short steps, probably because of gout. Kay didn't concern himself long with the guard or these people, especially as he saw it turning off the corridor, about halfway along it on the right-hand side, where there was no door to stop him going that way. He asked the usher whether that was the right way to go. The usher nodded, and that is the way that Kay went. The usher remained always 1 or 2 steps behind Kay, which he found irritating as in a place like this, it could give the impression that he was being driven along by someone who had arrested him, so he frequently waited for the usher to catch up, but the usher always remained behind him. In order to put an end to his discomfort, Kay finally said, "Now that I've seen what it looks like here, I'd like to go." "You haven't seen everything yet," said the usher ingenuously. "I don't want to see everything," said Kay, who was also feeling very tired. "I want to go. What is the way to the exit?" "You haven't got lost, have you?" asked the usher in amazement. "You go down this way to the corner, then right down the corridor straight ahead as far as the door." "Come with me," said Kay. "Show me the way, I'll miss it, there are so many different ways here." "It's the only way there is," said the usher, who had now started to sound quite reproachful. "I can't go back with you again, I've got to hand in my report, and I've already lost a lot of time because of you as it is. Come with me." Kay repeated, now somewhat sharper as if he had finally caught the usher out in a lie. "Don't shout like that," whispered the usher, "there's offices all round us here. If you don't want to go back by yourself, come on a bit further with me, or else wait here till I've sorted out my report, then I'll be glad to go back with you again." "No, no," said Kay, "I will not wait and you must come with me now." Kay had still not looked round at anything at all in the room where he found himself, and it was only when one of the many wooden doors all around him opened that he noticed it. A young woman, probably summoned by the loudness of Kay's voice, entered and asked, "What is it the gentleman wants?" In the darkness behind her there was also a man approaching. Kay looked at the usher. He had, after all, said that no one would take any notice of Kay, and now there were 2 people coming, it only needed a few, and everyone in the office would become aware of him and asking for explanations as to why he was there. The only understandable and acceptable thing to say was that he was accused of something and wanted to know the date of his next hearing, but this was an explanation he did not want to give, especially as it was not true, he had only come out of curiosity. Or else, an explanation even less usable, he could say that he wanted to ascertain that the court was as revolting on the inside as it was on the outside. And it did seem that he had been quite right in this supposition. He had no wish to intrude any deeper, he was disturbed enough by what he had seen already. He was not in the right frame of mind just then to face a high official, such as might appear from behind any door, and he wanted to go, either with the usher of the court or, if needs be, alone. But he must have seemed very odd standing there in silence, and the young woman and the usher were indeed looking at him, as if they thought he would go through some major metamorphosis any second which they didn't want to miss seeing. And in the doorway stood the man whom Kay had noticed in the background earlier. He held firmly on to the beam above the low door, swinging a little on the tips of his feet, as if becoming impatient as he watched. But the young woman was the first to recognize that Kay's behavior was caused by his feeling slightly unwell. She brought a chair and asked, "Would you not like to sit down?" Kay sat down immediately and, in order to keep his place better, put his elbows on the armrests. "You're a little bit dizzy, aren't you?" she asked him. Her face was now close in front of him. It bore the severe expression that many young women have just when they're in the bloom of their youth. "It's nothing for you to worry about," she said. "That's nothing unusual here. Almost everyone gets an attack like that the first time they come here." "This is your first time, is it?" "Yes, it's nothing unusual then. The sun burns down on the roof, and the hot wood makes the air so thick and heavy. It makes this place rather unsuitable for offices, whatever other advantages it might offer. But the air is almost impossible to breathe on days when there's a lot of business, and that's almost every day. And when you think that there's a lot of washing put out to dry here as well, and we can't stop the tenants doing that, it's not surprising you started to feel unwell. But you get used to the air all right in the end. When you're here for the second or third time you'll hardly notice how oppressive the air is." Are you feeling any better now? Kay made no answer. He felt too embarrassed at being put at the mercy of these people by his sudden weakness, and learning the reason for feeling ill made him feel not better, but a little worse. The girl noticed it straight away, and to make the air fresher for Kay, she took a window pole that was leaning against the wall and pushed open a small hatch directly above Kay's head that led to the outside. But so much soot fell in that the girl had to immediately close the hatch again and clean the soot off Kay's hands with her handkerchief, as Kay was too tired to do that for himself. He would have liked just to sit quietly where he was until he had enough strength to leave, and the less fuss people made about him the sooner that would be. But then the girl said, "You can't stay here, we're in people's way here." Kay looked at her, as if to ask whose way they were impeding. "If you like, I can take you to the sick room," and turning to the man in the doorway said, "Please help me." The man immediately came over to them, but Kay did not want to go to the sick room. That was just what he wanted to avoid, being led further from place to place. The further he went, the more difficult it must become. So he said, "I am able to walk now," and stood up, shaking after becoming used to sitting so comfortably. But then he was unable to stay upright. "I can't manage it," he said, shaking his head, and sat down again with a sigh. He remembered the usher who, despite everything, would have been able to lead him out of there, but who seemed to have gone long before. Kay looked out between the man and the young woman who were standing in front of him, but was unable to find the usher. "I think," said the man, who was elegantly dressed and whose appearance was made especially impressive with a grey waistcoat that had two long, sharply tailored points, "the gentleman is feeling unwell because of the atmosphere here, so the best thing, and what he would most prefer, would be not to take him to the sick room, but get him out of the offices altogether." "That's right," exclaimed Kay, with such joy that he nearly interrupted what the man was saying. "I'm sure that'll make me feel better straight away. I'm really not that weak, all I need is a little support under my arms. I won't cause you much trouble, it's not such a long way anyway. Lead me to the door, and then I'll sit on the stairs for a while and soon recover, as I don't suffer from attacks like this at all. I'm surprised at it myself. I also work in an office, and I'm quite used to office air, but here it seems to be too strong. You said so yourselves. So please, be so kind as to help me on my way a little. I'm feeling dizzy, you see, and it'll make me ill if I stand up by myself." And with that he raised his shoulders to make it easier for the two of them to take him by the arms. The man, however, didn't follow this suggestion, but just stood there with his hands in his trouser pockets and laughed out loud. "There, you see," he said to the girl, "I was quite right. The gentleman is only unwell here, and not in general." The young woman smiled too, but lightly tapped the man's arm with the tips of her fingers, as if he had allowed himself too much fun with Kay. "So what do you think, then?" said the man, still laughing. "I really do want to lead the gentleman out of here." "That's all right, then," said the girl, briefly inclining her charming head. "Don't worry too much about him," laughing, said the girl to Kay, who had become unhappy once more and stared quietly in front of himself, as if needing no further explanation. "This gentleman, may I introduce you?" The man gave his permission with a wave of the hand. "So, this gentleman's job is to give out information. He gives all the information they need to people who are waiting. As our court and its offices are not very well known among the public, he gets asked for quite a lot. He has an answer for every question. You can try him out if you feel like it. But that's not his only distinction. His other distinction is his elegance of dress. That's to say all of us who work in the offices here, we decided that the information giver would have to be elegantly dressed, as he continually has to deal with the litigants, and he's the first one they meet, so he needs to give a dignified first impression. The rest of us, I'm afraid, as you can see just by looking at me, dress very badly and old-fashioned, and there's not much point in spending much on clothes anyway, as we hardly ever leave the offices, we even sleep here. But, as I said, we decided that the information giver would have to have nice clothes. As the management here is rather peculiar in this respect, and they would get them for us, we had a collection some of the litigants contributed to, and bought him these lovely clothes and some others besides. So everything would be ready for him to give a good impression, except that he spoils it again by laughing and frightening people." "That's how it is," said the man, mocking her, "but I don't understand why it is that you're explaining all our intimate facts to the gentleman, or rather why it is that you're pressing them on him, as I'm sure he's not all interested. Just look at him sitting there, it's clear he's occupied with his own affairs." Kay just did not feel like contradicting him. The girl's intention may have been good, perhaps she was under instructions to distract him or to give him the chance to collect himself, but the attempt had not worked. "I had to explain to him why you were laughing," said the girl. "I suppose it was insulting. I think he would forgive even worse insults if I finally took him outside." Kay said nothing, did not even look up. He tolerated the two of them negotiating over him like an object. That was even what suited him best. But suddenly he felt the information giver's hand on one arm and the young woman's hand on the other. "Up you get then, weakling," said the information giver. "Thank you both very much," said Kay, pleasantly surprised, as he slowly rose and personally guided these unfamiliar hands to the places where he most needed support. As they approached the corridor, the girl said quietly into Kay's ear, "I must seem to think it's very important to show the information giver in a good light, but you shouldn't doubt what I say. I just want to say the truth. He isn't hard-hearted. It's not really his job to help litigants outside if they're unwell, but he's doing it anyway, as you can see. I don't suppose any of us is hard-hearted, perhaps we'd all like to be helpful, but working for the court offices, it's easy for us to give the impression we are hard-hearted and don't want to help anyone. It makes me quite sad. Would you not like to sit down here a while?" asked the information giver. They were already in the corridor and just in front of the defendant whom Kay had spoken to earlier. Kay felt almost ashamed to be seen by him. Earlier he had stood so upright in front of him, and now he had to be supported by two others. His hat was held up by the information giver balanced on outstretched fingers, his hair was disheveled and hung down onto the sweat on his forehead. But the defendant seemed to notice nothing of what was going on and just stood there humbly, as if wanting to apologize to the information giver for being there. The information giver looked past him. "I know," he said, "that my case can't be settled today, not yet, but I've come in anyway. I thought I could wait here anyway. It's Sunday today, I've got plenty of time, and I'm not disturbing anyone here." "There's no need to be so apologetic," said the information giver. "It's very commendable for you to be so attentive. You are taking up space here when you don't need to, but as long as you don't get in my way, I will do nothing to stop you following the progress of your case as closely as you like. When one has seen so many people who shamefully neglect their cases, one learns to show patience with people like you. Do sit down." "He's very good with the litigants," whispered the girl. Kay nodded, but started to move off again when the information giver repeated, "Would you not like to sit down here a while?" "No," said Kay, "I don't want to rest." He had said that with as decisively as he could, but in fact it would have done him a lot of good to sit down. It was as if he were suffering seasickness. He felt as if he were on a ship in a rough sea, as if the water were hitting against the wooden walls, a thundering from the depths of the corridor, as if the torrent were crashing over it, as if the corridor were swaying and the waiting litigants on each side of it rising and sinking. It made the calmness of the girl and the man leading him all the more incomprehensible. He was at their mercy. If they let go of him he would fall like a board. Their little eyes glanced here and there. Kay could feel the evenness of their steps, but could not do the same, as from step to step he was virtually being carried. He finally noticed they were speaking to him, but he did not understand them. All he heard was a noise that filled all the space, and through which there seemed to be an unchanging higher note sounding, like a siren. "Louder," he whispered with his head sunk low, ashamed at having to ask them to speak louder when he knew they had spoken loudly enough, even if it had been, for him, incomprehensible. At last, a draft of cool air blew in his face, as if a gap had been torn out in the wall in front of him, and next to him he heard someone say, "First he says he wants to go, and then you can tell him 100 times that this is the way out, and he doesn't move." Kay became aware that he was standing in front of the way out, and that the young woman had opened the door. It seemed to him that all his strength returned to him at once, and to get a foretaste of freedom, he stepped straight onto one of the stairs and took his leave there of his companions, who bowed to him. "Thank you very much," he repeated, shook their hands once more and did not let go until he thought he saw that they found it hard to bear the comparatively fresh air from the stairway after being so long used to the air in the offices. They were hardly able to reply, and the young woman might even have fallen over if Kay had not shut the door extremely fast. Kay then stood still for a while, combed his hair with the help of a pocket mirror, picked up his hat from the next stair. The information giver must have thrown it down there, and then he ran down the steps so fresh and in such long leaps that the contrast with his previous state nearly frightened him. His normally sturdy state of health had never prepared him for surprises such as this. Did his body want to revolt and cause him a new trial as he was bearing the old one with such little effort? He did not quite reject the idea that he should see a doctor the next time he had the chance, but whatever he did, and this was something on which he could advise himself, he wanted to spend all Sunday mornings in future better than he had spent this one. Chapter 4 Miss Burstner's friend. For some time after this, Kay found it impossible to exchange even just a few words with Miss Burstner. He tried to reach her in many and various ways, but she always found a way to avoid it. He would come straight home from the office, remain in her room without the light on, and sit on the sofa with nothing more to distract him than keeping watch on the empty hallway. If the maid went by and closed the door of the apparently empty room, he would get up after a while and open it again. He got up an hour earlier than usual in the morning, so that he might perhaps find Miss Burstner alone as she went to the office. But none of these efforts brought any success. Then he wrote her a letter, both to the office and the flat, attempting once more to justify his behavior, offered to make whatever amends he could, promised never to cross whatever boundary she might set him, and begged merely to have the chance to speak to her sometime, especially as he was unable to do anything with Mrs. Grubach, either until he had spoken with Miss Burstner. He finally informed her that the following Sunday, he would stay in his room all day, waiting for a sign from her that there was some hope of his request being fulfilled, or at least that she would explain to him why she could not fulfill it, even though he had promised to observe whatever stipulations she might make. The letters were not returned, but there was no answer either. However, on the following Sunday there was a sign that seemed clear enough. It was still early when Kay noticed, through the keyhole, that there was an unusual level of activity in the hallway which soon abated. A French teacher, although she was German and called Montag, a pale and febrile girl with a slight limp who had previously occupied a room of her own, was moving into Miss Burstner's room. She could be seen shuffling through the hallway for several hours. There was always another piece of clothing or a blanket or a book that she had forgotten and had to be fetched specially and brought into the new home. When Mrs. Grubach brought Kay his breakfast, ever since the time when she had made Kay so cross she didn't trust the maid to do the slightest job, he had no choice but to speak to her, for the first time in 5 days. "Why is there so much noise in the hallway today?" he asked as she poured his coffee out. "Can't something be done about it? Does this clearing out have to be done on a Sunday?" Kay did not look up at Mrs. Grubach, but he saw nonetheless that she seemed to feel some relief as she breathed in. Even sharp questions like this from Mr. K she perceived as forgiveness, or as the beginning of forgiveness. "We're not clearing anything out, Mr. K," she said. "It's just that Miss Montag is moving in with Miss Burstner and is moving her things across." She said nothing more, but just waited to see how Kay would take it and whether he would allow her to carry on speaking. But Kay kept her in uncertainty, took the spoon and pensively stirred his coffee while he remained silent. Then he looked up at her and said, "What about the suspicions you had earlier about Miss Burstner? Have you given them up?" Mr. K called Mrs. Grubach, who had been waiting for this very question, as she put her hands together and held them out towards him. "I just made a chance remark and you took it so badly. I didn't have the slightest intention of offending anyone, not you or anyone else. You've known me for long enough, Mr. K, I'm sure you're convinced of that. You don't know how I've been suffering for the past few days. That I should tell lies about my tenants. And you, Mr. K, you believed it. And said I should give you notice. Give you notice." At this last outcry, Mrs. Grubach was already choking back her tears. She raised her apron to her face and blubbered out loud. "Oh, don't cry, Mrs. Grubach," said Kay, looking out the window. He was thinking only of Miss Burstner and how she was accepting an unknown girl into her room. "Now don't cry," he said again as he turned his look back into the room where Mrs. Grubach was still crying. "I meant no harm either when I said that. It was simply a misunderstanding between us. That can happen even between old friends sometimes." Mrs. Grubach pulled her apron down to below her eyes to see whether Kay really was attempting a reconciliation. "Well, yes, that's how it is," said Kay, and as Mrs. Grubach's behavior indicated that the captain had said nothing he dared to add, "Do you really think, then, that I'd want to make an enemy of you for the sake of a girl we hardly know?" "Yes, you're quite right, Mr. K," said Mrs. Grubach, and then, to her misfortune, as soon as she felt just a little freer to speak, she added something rather inept. "I kept asking myself why it was that Mr. K took such an interest in Miss Burstner. Why does he quarrel with me over her when he knows that any cross word from him and I can't sleep that night? And I didn't say anything about Miss Burstner that I hadn't seen with my own eyes." Kay said nothing in reply. He should have chased her from the room as soon as she had opened her mouth, and he didn't want to do that. He contented himself with merely drinking his coffee and letting Mrs. Grubach feel that she was superfluous. Outside, the dragging steps of Miss Montag could still be heard as she went from one side of the hallway to the other. "Do you hear that?" asked Kay, pointing his hand at the door. "Yes," said Mrs. Grubach with a sigh. "I wanted to give her some help, and I wanted the maid to help her too, but she's stubborn, she wants to move everything in herself. I wonder at Miss Burstner. I often feel it's a burden for me to have Miss Montag as a tenant, but Miss Burstner accepts her into her room with herself." "There's nothing there for you to worry about," said Kay, crushing the remains of a sugar lump in his cup. "Does she cause you any trouble?" "No," said Mrs. Grubach, "in itself it's very good to have her there, it makes another room free for me, and I can let my nephew, the captain, occupy it. I began to worry he might be disturbing you when I had to let him live in the living room next to you over the last few days. He's not very considerate." "What an idea," said Kay, standing up. "There's no question of that. You seem to think that because I can't stand this toing and froing of Miss Montag that I'm oversensitive, and there she goes back again." Mrs. Grubach appeared quite powerless. "Should I tell her to leave moving the rest of her things over till later, then, Mr. Kay? If that's what you want, I'll do it immediately." "But she has to move in with Miss Burstner," said Kay. "Yes," said Mrs. Grubach, without quite understanding what Kay meant. "So she has to take her things over there." Mrs. Grubach just nodded. Kay was irritated all the more by this dumb helplessness which, seen from the outside, could have seemed like a kind of defiance on her part. He began to walk up and down the room between the window and the door, thus depriving Mrs. Grubach of the chance to leave, which she otherwise probably would have done. Just as Kay once more reached the door, someone knocked at it. It was the maid, to say that Miss Montag would like to have a few words with Mr. Kay, and therefore requested that he come to the dining room where she was waiting for him. Kay heard the maid out thoughtfully, and then looked back at the shocked Mrs. Grubach in a way that was almost contemptuous. His look seemed to be saying that Kay had been expecting this invitation from Miss Montag for a long time, and that it was confirmation of the suffering he had been made to endure that Sunday morning from Mrs. Grubach's tenants. He sent the maid back with the reply that he was on his way. Then he went to the wardrobe to change his coat, and in answer to Mrs. Grubach's gentle whining about the nuisance Miss Montag was causing, merely asked her to clear away the breakfast things. "But you've hardly touched it," said Mrs. Grubach. "Oh, just take it away," shouted Kay. It seemed to him that Miss Montag was mixed up in everything and made it repulsive to him. As he went through the hallway, he looked at the closed door of Miss Burstner's room. But it wasn't there that he was invited, but the dining room, to which he yanked the door open without knocking. The room was long but narrow with one window. There was only enough space available to put two cupboards at an angle in the corner by the door, and the rest of the room was entirely taken up with the long dining table which started by the door and reached all the way to the great window, which was thus made almost inaccessible. The table was already laid for a large number of people, as on Sundays almost all the tenants ate their dinner here at midday. When Kay entered, Miss Montag came towards him from the window along one side of the table. They greeted each other in silence. Then Miss Montag, her head unusually erect as always, said, "I'm not sure whether you know me." Kay looked at her with a frown. "Of course I do," he said. "You've been living here with Mrs. Grubach for quite some time now. But I get the impression you don't pay much attention to what's going on in the lodging house," said Miss Montag. "No," said Kay. "Would you not like to sit down?" said Miss Montag. In silence, the two of them drew chairs out from the farthest end of the table and sat down facing each other. But Miss Montag stood straight up again. As she had left her handbag on the windowsill and went to fetch it, she shuffled down the whole length of the room. When she came back, the handbag lightly swinging, she said, "I'd like just to have a few words with you on behalf of my friend. She would have come herself, but she's feeling a little unwell today. Perhaps you'll be kind enough to forgive her and listen to me instead. There's anyway nothing that she could have said that I won't. On the contrary, in fact, I think I can say even more than her because I'm relatively impartial. Would you not agree?" "What is there to say, then?" answered Kay, who was tired of Miss Montag continuously watching his lips. In that way she took control of what he wanted to say before he said it. "Miss Burstner clearly refuses to grant me the personal meeting that I asked her for." "That's how it is," said Miss Montag, "or rather, that's not at all how it is. The way you put it is remarkably severe. Generally speaking, meetings are neither granted nor the opposite. But it can be that meetings are considered unnecessary, and that's how it is here. Now, after your comment, I can speak openly. You asked my friend, verbally or in writing, for the chance to speak with her. Now my friend is aware of your reasons for asking for this meeting, or at least I suppose she is, and so, for reasons I know nothing about, she is quite sure that it would be of no benefit to anyone if this meeting actually took place. Moreover, it was only yesterday, and only very briefly, that she made it clear to me that such a meeting could be of no benefit for yourself either. She feels that it can only have been a matter of chance that such an idea came to you, and that even without any explanations from her, you will very soon come to realize yourself, if you have not done so already, the futility of your idea. My answer to that is that although it may be quite right, I consider it advantageous, if the matter is to be made perfectly clear, to give you an explicit answer. I offered my services in taking on the task, and after some hesitation my friend conceded. I hope, however, also to have acted in your interests, as even the slightest uncertainty in the least significant of matters will always remain a cause of suffering, and if, as in this case, it can be removed without substantial effort, then it is better if that is done without delay. I thank you, said Kay as soon as Miss Montag had finished. He stood slowly up, looked at her, then across the table, then out the window. The house opposite stood there in the sun, and went to the door. Miss Montag followed him a few paces, as if she did not quite trust him. At the door, however, both of them had to step back as it opened, and Captain Lenz entered. This was the first time that Kay had seen him close up. He was a large man of about 40 with a tanned fleshy face. He bowed slightly, intending it also for Kay, and then went over to Miss Montag and deferentially kissed her hand. He was very elegant in the way he moved. The courtesy he showed towards Miss Montag made a striking contrast with the way she had been treated by Kay. Nonetheless, Miss Montag did not seem to be cross with Kay, as it even seemed to him that she wanted to introduce the captain. Kay, however, did not want to be introduced. He would not have been able to show any sort of friendliness either to Miss Montag or to the captain. The kiss on the hand had, for Kay, bound them into a group which would keep him at a distance from Miss Burstner, whilst at the same time seeming to be totally harmless and unselfish. Kay thought, however, that he saw more than that. He thought he also saw that Miss Montag had chosen a means of doing it that was good, but two-edged. She exaggerated the importance of the relationship between Kay and Miss Burstner, and above all, she exaggerated the importance of asking to speak with her, and she tried at the same time to make out that Kay was exaggerating everything. She would be disappointed. Kay did not want to exaggerate anything. He was aware that Miss Burstner was a little typist who would not offer him much resistance for long. In doing so, he deliberately took no account of what Mrs. Grubach had told him about Miss Burstner. All these things were going through his mind as he left the room with hardly a polite word. He wanted to go straight to his room, but a little laugh from Miss Montag that he heard from the dining room behind him brought him to the idea that he might prepare a surprise for the two of them, the captain and Miss Montag. He looked round and listened to find out if there might be any disturbance from any of the surrounding rooms. Everywhere was quiet. The only thing to be heard was the conversation from the dining room and Mrs. Grubach's voice from the passage leading to the kitchen. This seemed an opportune time. Kay went to Miss Burstner's room and knocked gently. There was no sound, so he knocked again, but there was still no answer in reply. Was she asleep? Or was she really unwell? Or was she just pretending as she realized it could only be Kay knocking so gently? Kay assumed she was pretending and knocked harder. Eventually, when the knocking brought no result, he carefully opened the door with the sense of doing something that was not only improper, but also pointless. In the room there was no one. What's more, it looked hardly at all like the room Kay had known before. Against the wall there were now two beds behind one another. There were clothes piled up on 3 chairs near the door. A wardrobe stood open. Miss Burstner must have gone out while Miss Montag was speaking to him in the dining room. Kay was not greatly bothered by this. He had hardly expected to be able to find Miss Burstner so easily, and had made this attempt for little more reason than to spite Miss Montag. But that made it all the more embarrassing for him when, as he was closing the door again, he saw Miss Montag and the captain talking in the open doorway of the dining room. They had probably been standing there ever since Kay had opened the door. They avoided seeming to observe Kay, but chatted lightly and followed his movements with glances, the absent-minded glances to the side such as you make during a conversation. But these glances were heavy for Kay, and he rushed alongside the wall back into his own room. Chapter 5 The Whip Man. One evening, a few days later, Kay was walking along one of the corridors that separated his office from the main stairway. He was nearly the last one to leave for home that evening. There remained only a couple of workers in the light of a single bulb in the dispatch department when he heard a sigh from behind a door which he had himself never opened, but which he had always thought just led into a junk room. He stood in amazement and listened again to establish whether he might not be mistaken. For a while there was silence, but then came some more sighs. His first thought was to fetch one of the servitors. It might well have been worth having a witness present, but then he was taken by an uncontrollable curiosity that made him simply yank the door open. It was, as he had thought, a junk room. Old, unusable forms, empty stone ink bottles lay scattered behind the entrance. But in the cupboard-like room itself stood 3 men, crouching under the low ceiling. A candle fixed on a shelf gave them light. "What are you doing here?" asked Kay quietly, but crossly and without thinking. One of the men was clearly in charge and attracted attention by being dressed in a kind of dark leather costume which left his neck and chest and his arms exposed. He did not answer. But the other 2 called out, "Mr. Kay, we're to be beaten because you made a complaint about us to the examining judge." And now, Kay finally realized that it was actually the 2 policemen, Franz and Willem, and that the 3rd man held a cane in his hand with which to beat them. "Well," said Kay, staring at them, "I didn't make any complaint, I only said what took place in my home. And your behavior was not entirely unobjectionable, after all." "Mr. Kay," said Willem, while Franz clearly tried to shelter behind him as protection from the 3rd man, "if you knew how badly we get paid you wouldn't think so badly of us. I've got a family to feed, and Franz here wanted to get married. You just have to get more money where you can. You can't do it just by working hard, not however hard you try. I was sorely tempted by your fine clothes. Policemen aren't allowed to do that sort of thing, course they aren't, and it wasn't right of us, but it's tradition that the clothes go to the officers. That's how it's always been, believe me. And it's understandable too, isn't it? What can things like that mean for anyone unlucky enough to be arrested? But if he starts talking about it openly then the punishment has to follow. I didn't know about any of this that you've been telling me, and I made no sort of request that you be punished. I was simply acting on principle." "Franz," said Willem, turning to the other policeman, "didn't I tell you that the gentleman didn't say he wanted us to be punished? Now you can hear for yourself, he didn't even know we'd have to be punished. Don't you let them persuade you, talking like that," said the 3rd man to Kay. "This punishment is both just and unavoidable." "Don't listen to him," said Willem, interrupting himself only to quickly bring his hand to his mouth when it had received a stroke of the cane. "We're only being punished because you made a complaint against us. Nothing would have happened to us otherwise, not even if they'd found out what we'd done. Can you call that justice? Both of us, me especially, we'd proved our worth as good police officers over a long period. You've got to admit yourself that as far as official work was concerned we did the job well. Things looked good for us, we had prospects. It's quite certain that we would have been made whip men too, like this one, only he had the luck not to have anyone make a complaint about him, as you really don't get many complaints like that. Only that's all finished now, Mr. K. Our careers are at an end. We're going to have to do work now that's far inferior to police work, and besides all this, we're going to get this terrible, painful beating." "Can the cane really cause so much pain, then?" asked Kay, testing the cane that the whip man swung in front of him. "We're going to have to strip off totally naked," said Willem. "Oh, I see," said Kay, looking straight at the whip man. His skin was burned brown like a sailor's, and his face showed health and vigorous. "Is there then no possibility of sparing these 2 their beating?" he asked him. "No," said the whipman, shaking his head with a laugh. "Get undressed," he ordered the policeman. And to Kay he said, "You shouldn't believe everything they tell you. It's the fear of being beaten, it's already made them a bit weak in the head. This one here, for instance," he pointed at Willem, "all that he told you about his career prospects, it's just ridiculous. Look at him, look how fat he is. The first strokes of the cane will just get lost in all that fat. Do you know what it is that's made him so fat? He's in the habit of, everyone that gets arrested by him, he eats their breakfast." "Didn't he eat up your breakfast?" "Yeah, I thought as much. But a man with a belly like that can't be made into a whipman and never will be, that is quite out of the question. There are whipmen like that," Willem insisted, who had just released the belt of his trousers. "No," said the whipman, striking him such a blow with the cane on his neck that it made him wince, "you shouldn't be listening to this, just get undressed." I would make it well worth your while if you would let them go," said Kay, and without looking at the whip man again, as such matters are best carried on with both pairs of eyes turned down, he pulled out his wallet. "And then you'd try and put in a complaint against me, too," said the whip man, "and get me flogged." "No. Now, do be reasonable," said Kay. "If I had wanted to get these two punished, I would not now be trying to buy their freedom, would I? I could simply close the door here behind me, go home and see or hear nothing more of it. But that's not what I'm doing. It really is of much more importance to me to let them go free. If I had realized they would be punished, or even that they might be punished, I would never have named them in the first place, as they are not the ones I hold responsible. It's the organization that's to blame, the high officials are the ones to blame. That's how it is," shouted the policeman, who then immediately received another blow on their backs, which were by now exposed. "If you had a senior judge here beneath your stick," said Kay, pressing down the cane as he spoke to stop it being raised once more, "I really would do nothing to stop you. On the contrary, I would even pay you money to give you all the more strength." "Yeah, that's all very plausible, what you're saying there," said the whip man, "only I'm not the sort of person you can bribe. It's my job to flog people, so I flog them." Franz, the policeman, had been fairly quiet so far, probably in expectation of a good result from Kay's intervention, but now he stepped forward to the door wearing just his trousers, kneeled down hanging on to Kay's arm and whispered, "Even if you can't get mercy shown for both of us, at least try and get me set free. Willem is older than me, he's less sensitive than me in every way, he even got a light beating a couple of years ago, but my record's still clean. I only did things the way I did because Willem led me onto it. He's been my teacher both for good and bad. Down in front of the bank my poor bride is waiting for me at the entrance. I'm so ashamed of myself, it's pitiful." His face was flowing over with tears, and he wiped it dry on Kay's coat. "I'm not going to wait any longer," said the whipman, taking hold of the cane in both hands and laying into Franz, while Willem cowered back in a corner and looked on secretly, not even daring to turn his head. Then, the sudden scream that shot out from Franz was long and irrevocable. It seemed to come not from a human being, but from an instrument that was being tortured. The whole corridor rang with it. It must have been heard by everyone in the building. "Don't shout like that," called out Kay, unable to prevent himself, and, as he looked anxiously in the direction from which the servitor would come, he gave Franz a shove, not hard, but hard enough for him to fall down unconscious, clawing at the ground with his hands by reflex. He still did not avoid being hit, the rod still found him on the floor, the tip of the rod swung regularly up and down, while he rolled to and fro under its blows. And now one of the servitors appeared in the distance, with another a few steps behind him. Kay had quickly thrown the door shut, gone over to one of the windows overlooking the yard and opened it. The screams had completely stopped. So that the servitor wouldn't come in, he called out, "It's only me." "Good evening, chief clerk," somebody called back. "Is there anything wrong?" No, answered Kay. "It's only a dog yelping in the yard." There was no sound from the servitors, so he added, "You can go back to what you were doing." He did not want to become involved with a conversation with them, and so he leant out of the window. A little while later, when he looked out in the corridor, they had already gone. Now, Kay remained at the window. He did not dare go back into the junk room, and he did not want to go home either. The yard he looked down into was small and rectangular. All around it were offices. All the windows were now dark, and only those at the very top caught a reflection of the moon. Kay tried hard to see into the darkness of one corner of the yard, where a few handcarts had been left behind one another. He felt anguish at not having been able to prevent the flogging, but that was not his fault. If Franz had not screamed like that, clearly it must have caused a great deal of pain, but it's important to maintain control of oneself at important moments. If Franz had not screamed, then it was at least highly probable that Kay would have been able to dissuade the whipman. If all the junior officers were contemptible, why would the whipman, whose position was the most inhumane of all, be any exception? And Kay had noticed very clearly how his eyes had lit up when he saw the banknotes. He had obviously only seemed serious about the flogging, to raise the level of the bribe a little. And Kay had not been ungenerous. He really had wanted to get the policeman freed. If he really had now begun to do something against the degeneracy of the court, then it was a matter of course that he would have to do something here as well. But of course, it became impossible for him to do anything as soon as Franz started screaming. Kay could not possibly have let the junior bank staff, and perhaps even all sorts of other people, come along and catch him by surprise as he haggled with those people in the junk room. Nobody could really expect that sort of sacrifice of him. If that had been his intention, then it would almost have been easier. Kay would have taken his own clothes off and offered himself to the whip man in the policeman's place. The whip man would certainly not have accepted this substitution anyway, as in that way he would have seriously violated his duty without gaining any benefit. He would most likely have violated his duty twice over, as court employees were probably under orders not to cause any harm to Kay while he was facing charges, although there may have been special conditions in force here. However things stood, Kay was able to do no more than throw the door shut, even though that would still do nothing to remove all the dangers he faced. It was regrettable that he had given Franz a shove, and it could only be excused by the heat of the moment. In the distance, he heard the steps of the servitors. He did not want them to be too aware of his presence, so he closed the window and walked towards the main staircase. At the door of the junk room he stopped and listened for a little while. All was silent. The two policemen were entirely at the whip man's mercy. He could have beaten them to death. Kay reached his hand out for the door handle, but drew it suddenly back. He was no longer in any position to help anyone, and the servitors would soon be back. He did, though, promise himself that he would raise the matter again with somebody and see that, as far as it was in his power, those who really were guilty, the high officials whom nobody had so far dared point out to him, received their due punishment. As he went down the main stairway at the front of the bank, he looked carefully round at everyone who was passing, but there was no girl to be seen who might have been waiting for somebody, not even within some distance from the bank. Franz's claim that his bride was waiting for him was thus shown to be a lie, albeit one that was forgivable and intended only to elicit more sympathy. The policemen were still on Kay's mind all through the following day. He was unable to concentrate on his work and had to stay in his office a little longer than the previous day so that he could finish it. On the way home, as he passed by the junk room again, he opened its door as if that had been his habit. Instead of the darkness he expected, he saw everything unchanged from the previous evening and did not know how he should respond. Everything was exactly the same as he had seen it when he had opened the door the previous evening. The forms and bottles of ink just inside the doorway, the whip man with his cane, the two policemen, still undressed, the candle on the shelf, and the two policemen began to wail and call out Mr. K. Kay slammed the door immediately shut and even thumped on it with his fists, as if that would shut it all the firmer. Almost in tears, he ran to the servitors working quietly at the copying machine. "Go and get that junk room cleared out," he shouted, and, in amazement, they stopped what they were doing. "It should have been done long ago, we're sinking in dirt." They would be able to do the job the next day, Kay nodded. It was too late in the evening to make them do it there, and then as he had originally intended. He sat down briefly in order to keep them near him for a little longer, looked through a few of the copies to give the impression that he was checking them, and then, as he saw that they would not dare to leave at the same time as himself, went home tired and with his mind numb. Chapter 6 Kay's Uncle Lenny. One afternoon Kay was very busy at the time, getting the post ready. Kay's uncle Carl, a small country landowner, came into the room, pushing his way between two of the staff who were bringing in some papers. Kay had long expected his uncle to appear, but the sight of him now shocked Kay far less than the prospect of it had done a long time before. His uncle was bound to come. Kay had been sure of that for about a month. He already thought at the time he could see how his uncle would arrive, slightly bowed, his battered Panama hat in his left hand, his right hand already stretched out over the desk, long before he was close enough as he rushed carelessly towards Kay, knocking over everything that was in his way. Kay's uncle was always in a hurry, as he suffered from the unfortunate belief that he had a number of things to do while he was in the big city, and had to settle all of them in one day. His visits were only ever for one day, and at the same time thought he could not forego any conversation or piece of business or pleasure that might arise by chance. Uncle Carl was Kay's former guardian, and so Kay was duty-bound to help him in all of this, as well as to offer him a bed for the night. "I'm haunted by a ghost from the country," he would say. As soon as they had greeted each other, Kay had invited him to sit in the armchair, but Uncle Carl had no time for that. He said he wanted to speak briefly with Kay in private. "It is necessary," he said with a tired gulp. "It is necessary for my peace of mind." Kay immediately sent the junior staff from the room and told them to let no one in. "What's this that I've been hearing, Joseph?" cried Kay's uncle when they were alone, as he sat on the table shoving various papers under himself without looking at them to make himself more comfortable. Kay said nothing. He knew what was coming, but, suddenly relieved from the effort of the work he had been doing, he gave way to a pleasant lassitude and looked out the window at the other side of the street. From where he sat, he could see just a small triangular section of it, part of the empty walls of houses between two shop windows. "You're staring out the window?" called out his uncle, raising his arms. "For God's sake, Joseph, give me an answer. Is it true? Can it really be true?" "Uncle Carl," said Kay, wrenching himself back from his daydreaming, "I really don't know what it is you want of me." "Joseph," said his uncle in a warning tone, "as far as I know, you've always told the truth. Am I to take what you've just said as a bad sign?" "I think I know what it is you want," said Kay obediently. "I expect you've heard about my trial." "That's right," answered his uncle with a slow nod. "I've heard about your trial." "Who did you hear it from, then?" asked Kay. "Erna wrote to me," said his uncle. "She doesn't have much contact with you, it's true, you don't pay very much attention to her, I'm afraid to say, but she learned about it nonetheless. I got her letter today and, of course, I came straight here. And for no other reason, but it seems to me that this is reason enough. I can read you out the part of the letter that concerns you." He drew the letter out from his wallet. "Here it is." She writes, "I have not seen Joseph for a long time. I was in the bank last week, but Joseph was so busy that they would not let me through. I waited there for nearly an hour, but then I had to go home as I had my piano lesson. I would have liked to have spoken to him, maybe there will be a chance another time. He sent me a big box of chocolates for my name day, that was very nice and attentive of him. I forgot to tell you about it when I wrote, and I only remember now that you asked me about it. Chocolate, as I am sure you are aware, disappears straight away in this lodging house. Almost as soon as you know somebody has given you chocolate it is gone. But there is something else I wanted to tell you about Joseph. Like I said, they would not let me through to see him at the bank because he was negotiating with some gentleman just then. After I had been waiting quietly for quite a long time, I asked one of the staff whether his meeting would last much longer. He said it might well do, as it was probably about the legal proceedings, he said, that were being conducted against him. I asked what sort of legal proceedings it was that were being conducted against the chief clerk, and whether he was not making some mistake, but he said he was not making any mistake. There were legal proceedings underway, and even that they were about something quite serious, but he did not know any more about it. He would have liked to have been of some help to the chief clerk himself, as the chief clerk was a gentleman, good and honest, but he did not know what it was he could do, and merely hoped there would be some influential gentleman who would take his side. I'm sure that is what will happen, and that everything will turn out for the best in the end, but in the meantime things do not look at all good, and you can see that from the mood of the chief clerk himself. Of course, I did not place too much importance on this conversation, and even did my best to put the bank clerk's mind at rest. He was quite a simple man. I told him he was not to speak to anyone else about this, and I think it is all just a rumor, but I still think it might be good if you, dear father, if you looked into the matter the next time you visit. It will be easy for you to find out more detail and, if it is really necessary, to do something about it through the great and influential people you know. But if it is not necessary, and that is what seems most likely, then at least your daughter will soon have the chance to embrace you, and I look forward to it. She's a good child," said Kay's uncle when he had finished reading, and wiped a few tears from his eyes. Kay nodded. With all the different disruptions he had had recently, he had completely forgotten about Erna, even her birthday, and the story of the chocolates had clearly just been invented so that he wouldn't get in trouble with his aunt and uncle. It was very touching, and even the theater tickets, which he would regularly send her from then on, would not be enough to repay her, but he really did not feel, now, that it was right for him to visit her in her lodgings and hold conversations with a little 18-year-old schoolgirl. "And what do you have to say about that?" asked his uncle, who had forgotten all his rush and excitement as he read the letter and seemed to be about to read it again. "Yes, uncle," said Kay, "it is true." "True?" called out his uncle. "What is true? How can this be true? What sort of trial is it? Not a criminal trial, I hope?" "It's a criminal trial," answered Kay. "And you sit quietly here while you've got a criminal trial round your neck?" shouted his uncle, getting ever louder. "The more calm I am, the better it will be for the outcome," said Kay in a tired voice. "Don't worry." "How can I help worrying?" shouted his uncle. "Joseph, my dear Joseph, think about yourself, about your family, think about our good name. Up till now, you've always been our pride, don't now become our disgrace." "I don't like the way you're behaving," he said, looking at Kay with his head at an angle. "That's not how an innocent man behaves when he's accused of something, not if he's still got any strength in him. Just tell me what it's all about so that I can help you. It's something to do with the bank, I take it?" No, said Kay as he stood up, and you're speaking too loud, uncle. I expect one of the staff is listening at the door, and I find that rather unpleasant. It's best if we go somewhere else, then I can answer all your questions, as far as I can. And I know very well that I have to account to the family for what I do. You certainly do. His uncle shouted, quite right, you do. Now just get a move on, Joseph, hurry up now. I still have a few documents I need to prepare, said Kay, and, using the intercom, he summoned his deputy who entered a few moments later. Kay's uncle, still angry and excited, gestured with his hand to show that Kay had summoned him, even though there was no need whatever to do so. Kay stood in front of the desk and explained to the young man, who listened calm and attentive, what would need to be done that day in his absence, speaking in a calm voice and making use of various documents. The presence of Kay's uncle while this was going on was quite disturbing. He did not listen to what was being said, but at first he stood there with eyes wide open and nervously biting his lips. Then he began to walk up and down the room, stopped now and then at the window, or stood in front of a picture, always making various exclamations such as, "That is totally incomprehensible to me." Or, "Now just tell me, what are you supposed to make of that?" The young man pretended to notice nothing of this and listened to Kay's instructions through to the end. He made a few notes, bowed to both Kay and his uncle, and then left the room. Kay's uncle had turned his back to him and was looking out the window, bunching up the curtains with his outstretched hands. The door had hardly closed when he called out, "At last. Now that he's stopped jumping about, we can go too." Once they were in the front hall of the bank, where several members of staff were standing about and where, just then, the deputy director was walking across, there was unfortunately no way of stopping Kay's uncle from continually asking questions about the trial. "Now then, Joseph," he began, lightly acknowledging the bows from those around them as they passed, "tell me everything about this trial. What sort of trial is it?" Kay made a few comments which conveyed little information, even laughed a little, and it was only when they reached the front steps that he explained to his uncle that he had not wanted to talk openly in front of those people. "Quite right," said his uncle, "but now start talking." With his head to one side and smoking his cigar in short, impatient drafts, he listened. "First of all, uncle," said Kay, "it's not a trial like you'd have in a normal courtroom." "So much the worse," said his uncle. "How's that?" asked Kay, looking at him. "What I mean is, that's for the worse," he repeated. They were standing on the front steps of the bank. As the doorkeeper seemed to be listening to what they were saying, Kay drew his uncle down further, where they were absorbed into the bustle of the street. His uncle took Kay's arm and stopped asking questions with such urgency about the trial. They walked on for a while in silence. "But how did all this come about?" he eventually asked, stopping abruptly enough to startle the people walking behind, who had to avoid walking into him. "Things like this don't come all of a sudden, they start developing a long time beforehand. There must have been warning signs of it. Why didn't you write to me? You know I'd do anything for you. To some extent I am still your guardian, and until today that's something I was proud of. I'll still help you, of course I will, only now that the trial is already underway, it makes it very difficult. But whatever, the best thing now is for you to take a short holiday staying with us in the country. You've lost weight, I can see that now. The country life will give you strength, that will be good. There's bound to be a lot of hard work ahead of you. But besides that, it'll be a way of getting you away from the court, to some extent. Here they've got every means of showing the powers at their disposal, and they're automatically bound to use them against you. In the country, they'll either have to delegate authority to different bodies, or just have to try and bother you by letter, telegram or telephone. And that's bound to weaken the effect. It won't release you from them, but it'll give you room to breathe." "You could forbid me to leave," said Kay, who had been drawn slightly into his uncle's way of thinking by what he had been saying. "I didn't think you would do it," said his uncle thoughtfully. "You won't suffer too much loss of power by moving away." Kay grasped his uncle under the arm to prevent him stopping still and said, "I thought you'd think all this is less important than I do, and now you're taking it so hard." Joseph called his uncle, trying to disentangle himself from him so that he could stop walking, but Kay did not let go. "You've completely changed. You used to be so astute. Are you losing it now? Do you want to lose the trial? Do you realize what that would mean? That would mean you would be simply destroyed. And that everyone you know would be pulled down with you, or at the very least humiliated, disgraced right down to the ground. Joseph, pull yourself together. The way you're so indifferent about it, it's driving me mad. Looking at you, I can almost believe that old saying. Having a trial like that means losing a trial like that. My dear uncle, said Kay, it won't do any good to get excited, it's no good for you to do it, and it'd be no good for me to do it. The case won't be won by getting excited, and please admit that my practical experience counts for something, just as I have always and still do respect your experience, even when it surprises me. You say that the family will also be affected by this trial. I really can't see how, but that's beside the point, and I'm quite willing to follow your instructions in all of this. Only, I don't see any advantage in staying in the country, not even for you, as that would indicate flight into sense of guilt. And besides, although I am more subject to persecution if I stay in the city, I can also press the matter forward better here. You're right, said his uncle in a tone that seemed to indicate they were finally coming closer to each other. I just made the suggestion because, as I saw it, if you stay in the city the case will be put in danger by your indifference to it, and I thought it was better if I did the work for you. But will you push things forward yourself with all your strength? If so, that will naturally be far better. We're agreed then, said Kay. And do you have any suggestions for what I should do next? Well, naturally I'll have to think about it, said his uncle. You must bear in mind that I've been living in the country for 20 years now, almost without a break. You lose your ability to deal with matters like this. But I do have some important connections with several people who, I expect, know their way around these things better than I do, and to contact them is a matter of course. Out there in the country I've been getting out of condition, I'm sure you're already aware of that. It's only at times like this that you notice it yourself. And this affair of yours came largely unexpected, although, oddly enough, I had expected something of the sort after I'd read Erna's letter, and today when I saw your face I knew it with almost total certainty. But all that is by the by, the important thing now is, we have no time to lose. Even while he was still speaking, Kay's uncle had stood on tiptoe to summon a taxi, and now he pulled Kay into the car behind himself, as he called out an address to the driver. We're going now to see Dr. Huld, the lawyer, he said. We were at school together. I'm sure you know the name, don't you? No? Well, that is odd. He's got a very good reputation as a defense barrister and for working with the poor. But I esteem him especially as someone you can trust. It's all right with me, whatever you do, said Kay, although he was made uneasy by the rushed and urgent way his uncle was dealing with the matter. It was not very encouraging, as the accused, be taken to a lawyer for poor people. I didn't know, he said, that you could take on a lawyer in matters like this. Well, of course you can, said his uncle, that goes without saying. Why wouldn't you take on a lawyer? And now, so that I'm properly instructed in this matter, tell me what's been happening so far. Kay instantly began telling his uncle about what had been happening, holding nothing back, being completely open with him, was the only way that Kay could protest at his uncle's belief that the trial was a great disgrace. He mentioned Miss Burstner's name just once and in passing, but that did nothing to diminish his openness about the trial, as Miss Burstner had no connection with it. As he spoke, he looked out the window and saw how, just then, they were getting closer to the suburb where the court offices were. He drew this to his uncle's attention, but he did not find the coincidence especially remarkable. The taxi stopped in front of a dark building. Kay's uncle knocked at the very first door at ground level. While they waited, he smiled, showing his big teeth, and whispered, 8 o'clock, not the usual sort of time to be visiting a lawyer, but Huld won't mind it from me. 2 large black eyes appeared in the spy hatch in the door. They stared at the 2 visitors for a while and then disappeared. The door, however, did not open. Kay and his uncle confirmed to each other the fact that they had seen the 2 eyes. A new maid, afraid of strangers, said Kay's uncle, and knocked again. The eyes appeared once more. This time they seemed almost sad, but the open gas flame that burned with a hiss close above their heads gave off little light, and that may have merely created an illusion. Open the door, called Kay's uncle, raising his fist against it. We are friends of Dr. Huld, the lawyer. Dr. Huld is ill, whispered someone behind them. In a doorway at the far end of a narrow passage stood a man in his dressing gown, giving them this information in an extremely quiet voice. Kay's uncle, who had already been made very angry by the long wait, turned abruptly round and retorted, "Ill? You say he's ill?" and strode towards the gentleman in a way that seemed almost threatening, as if he were the illness himself. "They've opened the door for you, now," said the gentleman, pointing at the door of the lawyer. He pulled his dressing gown together and disappeared. The door had indeed been opened. A young girl Kay recognized. The dark, slightly bulging eyes stood in the hallway in a long white apron, holding a candle in her hand. "Next time, open up sooner," said Kay's uncle instead of a greeting, while the girl made a slight curtsy. "Come along, Joseph," he then said to Kay, who was slowly moving over towards the girl. Dr. Holt is unwell, said the girl as Kay's uncle, without stopping, rushed towards one of the doors. Kay continued to look at the girl in amazement as she turned round to block the way into the living room. She had a round face like a puppy's. Not only the pale cheeks and the chin were round, but the temples and the hairline were too. Joseph called his uncle once more, and he asked the girl, "It's trouble with his heart, is it?" "I think it is, sir," said the girl, who by now had found time to go ahead with the candle and open the door into the room. In one corner of the room, where the light of the candle did not reach, a face with a long beard looked up from the bed. "Leanie, who's this coming in?" asked the lawyer, unable to recognize his guests because he was dazzled by the candle. "It's your old friend, Albert," said Kay's uncle. "Oh, Albert," said the lawyer, falling back onto his pillow as if this visit meant he would not need to keep up appearances. "Is it really as bad as that?" asked Kay's uncle, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I don't believe it is. It's a recurrence of your heart trouble and it'll pass over like the other times." "Maybe," said the lawyer quietly, "but it's just as much trouble as it's ever been. I can hardly breathe, I can't sleep at all, and I'm getting weaker by the day." "I see," said Kay's uncle, pressing his Panama hat firmly against his knee with his big hand. "That is bad news. But are you getting the right sort of care? And it's so depressing in here, it's so dark. It's a long time since I was last here, but it seemed to me friendlier then. Even your young lady here doesn't seem to have much life in her, unless she's just pretending." The maid was still standing by the door with the candle. As far as could be made out, she was watching Kay more than she was watching his uncle, even while the latter was still speaking about her. Kay leant against a chair that he had pushed near to the girl. "When you're as ill as I am," said the lawyer, "you need to have peace. I don't find it depressing." After a short pause he added, "And Leanie looks after me well, she's a good girl." But that was not enough to persuade Kay's uncle. He had visibly taken against his friend's carer, and, even though he did not contradict the invalid, he persecuted her with his scowl as she went over to the bed, put the candle on the bedside table, and, leaning over the bed, made a fuss of him by tidying the pillows. Kay's uncle nearly forgot the need to show any consideration for the man who lay ill in bed. He stood up, walked up and down behind the carer, and Kay would not have been surprised if he had grabbed hold of her skirts behind her and dragged her away from the bed. Kay himself looked on calmly. He was not even disappointed at finding the lawyer unwell. He had been able to do nothing to oppose the enthusiasm his uncle had developed for the matter. He was glad that this enthusiasm had now been distracted without his having to do anything about it. His uncle, probably simply wishing to be offensive to the lawyer's attendant, then said, "Young lady, now please leave us alone for a while. I have some personal matters to discuss with my friend." Dr. Hull's carer was still leant far over the invalid's bed and smoothing out the cloth covering the wall next to it. She merely turned her head and then, in striking contrast with the anger that first stopped Kay's uncle from speaking and then let the words out in a gush, she said very quietly, "You can see that Dr. Hull is so ill that he can't discuss any matters at all." It was probably just for the sake of convenience that she had repeated the words spoken by Kay's uncle, but an onlooker might even have perceived it as mocking him, and he, of course, jumped up as if he had just been stabbed. "You damned!" In the first gurglings of his excitement his words could hardly be understood. Kay was startled, even though he had been expecting something of the sort, and ran to his uncle with the intention, no doubt, of closing his mouth with both his hands. Fortunately, though, behind the girl, the invalid raised himself up. Kay's uncle made an ugly face as if swallowing something disgusting, and then, somewhat calmer, said, "We have naturally not lost our senses, not yet. If what I am asking for were not possible, I would not be asking for it. Now please, go." The carer stood up straight by the bed directly facing Kay's uncle. Kay thought he noticed that with one hand she was stroking the lawyer's hand. "You can say anything in front of Leanie," said the invalid, in a tone that was unmistakably imploring. "It's not my business," said Kay's uncle, "and it's not my secrets." And he twisted himself round as if wanting to go into no more negotiations, but giving himself a little more time to think. "Whose business is it then?" asked the lawyer in an exhausted voice as he leant back again. "My nephew," said Kay's uncle, "and I brought him along with me." And he introduced him, Chief Clerk Joseph K. "Oh," said the invalid, now with much more life in him, and reached out his hand towards Kay. "Do forgive me, I didn't notice you there at all." Then he said to his carer, "Leanie, go," stretching his hand out to her, as if this were a farewell that would have to last for a long time. This time the girl offered no resistance. "So you," he finally said to Kay's uncle, who had also calmed down and stepped closer, "you haven't come to visit me because I'm ill, but you've come on business." The lawyer now looked so much stronger that it seemed the idea of being visited because he was ill had somehow made him weak. He remained supporting himself of one elbow, which must have been rather tiring, and continually pulled at a lock of hair in the middle of his beard. "You already look much better," said Kay's uncle, "now that witch has gone outside." He interrupted himself, whispered, "I bet you she's listening," and sprang over to the door. But behind the door there was no one. Kay's uncle came back not disappointed, as her not listening seemed to him worse than if she had been, but probably somewhat embittered. "You're mistaken about her," said the lawyer, but did nothing more to defend her. Perhaps that was his way of indicating that she did not need defending. But in a tone that was much more committed he went on, "As far as your nephew's affairs are concerned, this will be an extremely difficult undertaking, and I'd count myself lucky if my strength lasted out long enough for it. I'm greatly afraid it won't do, but anyway, I don't want to leave anything untried. If I don't last out, you can always get somebody else. To be honest, this matter interests me too much, and I can't bring myself to give up the chance of taking some part in it. If my heart does totally give out, then at least it will have found a worthy affair to fail in." Kay believed he understood not a word of this entire speech. He looked at his uncle for an explanation, but his uncle sat on the bedside table with the candle in his hand. A medicine bottle had rolled off the table onto the floor. He nodded to everything the lawyer said, agreed to everything, and now and then looked at Kay, urging him to show the same compliance. Maybe Kay's uncle had already told the lawyer about the trial. But that was impossible. Everything that had happened so far spoke against it. So he said, "I don't understand. Well, maybe I've misunderstood what you've been saying," said the lawyer, just as astonished and embarrassed as Kay. "Perhaps I've been going too fast. What was it you wanted to speak to me about?" "I thought it was to do with your trial." "Of course it is," said Kay's uncle, who then asked Kay, "So what is it you want?" "Yes, but how is it that you know anything about me and my case?" asked Kay. "Oh, I see," said the lawyer with a smile. "I am a lawyer. I move in court circles. People talk about various different cases, and the more interesting ones stay in your mind, especially when they concern the nephew of a friend. There's nothing very remarkable about that." "What is it you want, then?" asked Kay's uncle once more. "You seem so uneasy about it. You move in this court circles?" asked Kay. "Yes," said the lawyer. "You're asking questions like a child," said Kay's uncle. "What circles should I move in, then, if not with members of my own discipline?" the lawyer added. It sounded so indisputable that Kay gave no answer at all. "But you work in the high court, not that court in the attic," he had wanted to say, but could not bring himself to actually utter it. "You have to realize," the lawyer continued, in a tone as if he were explaining something obvious, unnecessary and incidental, "you have to realize that I also derive great advantage from my clients from mixing with those people, and do so in many different ways. It's not something you can keep talking about all the time. I'm at a bit of a disadvantage now, of course, because of my illness, but I still get visits from some good friends of mine at the court, and I learn one or two things. It might even be that I learn more than many of those who are in the best of health and spend all day in court. And I'm receiving a very welcome visit right now, for instance." And he pointed into a dark corner of the room. "Where?" asked Kay, almost uncouth in his surprise. He looked round uneasily. The little candle gave off far too little light to reach as far as the wall opposite. And then, something did indeed begin to move there in the corner. In the light of the candle held up by Kay's uncle, an elderly gentleman could be seen sitting beside a small table. He had been sitting there for so long without being noticed that he could hardly have been breathing. Now he stood up with a great deal of fuss, clearly unhappy that attention had been drawn to him. It was as if, by flapping his hands about like short wings, he hoped to deflect any introductions and greetings, as if he wanted on no account to disturb the others by his presence, and seemed to be exhorting them to leave him back in the dark and forget about his being there. That, however, was something that could no longer be granted him. "You took us by surprise, you see," said the lawyer in explanation, cheerfully indicating to the gentleman that he should come closer, which, slowly, hesitatingly, looking all around him, but with a certain dignity, he did. "The office director. Oh, yes, forgive me, I haven't introduced you. This is my friend Albert Kay, this is his nephew, the chief clerk Joseph Kay, and this is the office director." So, the office director was kind enough to pay me a visit. It's only possible to appreciate just how valuable a visit like this is if you've been let into the secret of what a pile of work the office director has heaped over him. Well, he came anyway. We were having a peaceful chat, as far as I was able when I'm so weak, and although we hadn't told Lini she mustn't let anyone in as we weren't expecting anyone, we still would rather have remained alone. But then along came you, Albert, thumping your fists on the door. The office director moved over into the corner, pulling his table and chair with him. But now it turns out we might have, that is, if that's what you wish, we might have something to discuss with each other, and it would be good if we can all come back together again. Office director, he said with his head on one side, pointing with a humble smile to an armchair near the bed. I'm afraid I'll only be able to stay a few minutes more, smiled the office director as he spread himself out in the armchair and looked at the clock. Business calls. But I wouldn't want to miss the chance of meeting a friend of my friend. He inclined his head slightly toward Kay's uncle, who seemed very happy with his new acquaintance, but he was not the sort of person to express his feelings of deference, and responded to the office director's words with embarrassed but loud laughter. A horrible sight. Kay was able to quietly watch everything as nobody paid any attention to him. The office director took over as leader of the conversation, as seemed to be his habit once he had been called forward. The lawyer listened attentively with his hand to his ear, his initial weakness having perhaps only had the function of driving away his new visitors. Kay's uncle served as candle-bearer, balancing the candle on his thigh, while the office director frequently glanced nervously at it and was soon free of his embarrassment and was quickly enchanted not only by the office director's speaking manner but also by the gentle waving hand movements with which he accompanied it. Kay, leaning against the bedpost, was totally ignored by the office director, perhaps deliberately, and served the old man only as audience. And besides, he had hardly any idea what the conversation was about, and his thoughts soon turned to the care assistant and the ill treatment she had suffered from his uncle. Soon after, he began to wonder whether he had not seen the office director somewhere before, perhaps among the people who were at his first hearing. He may have been mistaken, but thought the office director might well have been among the old gentlemen with the thin beards in the first row. There was then a noise that everyone heard from the hallway, as if something of porcelain were being broken. "I'll go and see what's happened," said Kay, who slowly left the room as if giving the others the chance to stop him. He had hardly stepped into the hallway, finding his bearings in the darkness with his hand still firmly holding the door, when another small hand, much smaller than Kay's own, placed itself on his and gently shut the door. It was the carer who had been waiting there. "Nothing has happened," she whispered to him. "I just threw a plate against the wall to get you out of there." "I was thinking about you as well," replied Kay uneasily. "So much the better," said the carer. "Come with me." A few steps along, they came to a frosted glass door which the carer opened for him. "Come in here," she said. It was clearly the lawyer's office, fitted out with old heavy furniture, as far as could be seen in the moonlight which now illuminated just a small rectangular section of the floor by each of the three big windows. "This way," said the carer, pointing to a dark trunk with a carved wooden backrest. When he had sat down, Kay continued to look round the room. It was a large room with a high ceiling. The clients of this lawyer for the poor must have felt quite lost in it. Kay thought he could see the little steps with which visitors would approach the massive desk. But then he forgot about all of this and had eyes only for the carer who sat very close beside him, almost pressing him against the armrest. "I did think," she said, "you would come out here to me by yourself with me having to call you first. It was odd. First you stare at me as soon as you come in, and then you keep me waiting. And you ought to call me Lini, too," she added quickly and suddenly, as if no moment of this conversation should be lost. "Gladly," said Kay. "But as for its being odd, Lini, that's easy to explain. Firstly, I had to listen to what the old men were saying and couldn't leave without a good reason, but secondly, I'm not a bold person. If anything, I'm quite shy, and you, Lini, you didn't really look like you could be won over in one stroke, either." "That's not it," said Lini, laying one arm on the armrest and looking at Kay. "You didn't like me, and I don't suppose you like me now, either." "Liking wouldn't be very much," said Kay, evasively. "Oh," she exclaimed with a smile, thus making use of Kay's comment to gain an advantage over him. So Kay remained silent for a while. By now, he had become used to the darkness in the room and was able to make out various fixtures and fittings. He was especially impressed by a large picture hanging to the right of the door. He leant forward in order to see it better. It depicted a man wearing a judge's robes. He was sitting on a lofty throne gilded in a way that shone forth from the picture. The odd thing about the picture was that this judge was not sitting there in dignified calm, but had his left arm pressed against the back and armrest, His right arm, however, was completely free and only grasped the armrest with his hand, as if about to jump up any moment in vigorous outrage and make some decisive comment or even to pass sentence. The accused was probably meant to be imagined at the foot of the steps, the top one of which could be seen in the picture, covered with a yellow carpet. "That might be my judge," said Kay, pointing to the picture with one finger. "I know him," said Leanie, looking up at the picture. "He comes here quite often. That picture is from when he was young, but he can never have looked anything like it, as he's tiny, minute almost. But despite that, he had himself made to look bigger in the picture as he's madly vain, just like everyone round here. But even I'm vain, and that makes me very unhappy that you don't like me." Kay replied to that last comment merely by embracing Leanie and drawing her towards him. She lay her head quietly on his shoulder. "To the rest of it, though," he said, "what rank is he?" "He's an examining judge," she said, taking hold of the hand with which Kay held her and playing with his fingers. "Just an examining judge once again," said Kay in disappointment. "The senior officials keep themselves hidden. But here he is sitting on a throne." "That's all just made up," said Leanie with her face bent over Kay's hand. "Really, he's sitting on a kitchen chair with an old horse blanket folded over it." "But do you have to be always thinking about your trial?" she added slowly. "No, not at all," said Kay. "I probably even think too little about it." "That's not the mistake you're making," said Leanie. "You're too unyielding, that's what I've heard." "Who said that?" asked Kay. He felt her body against his chest and looked down on her rich, dark, tightly bound hair. "I'd be saying too much if I told you that," answered Leanie. "Please don't ask for names, but do stop making these mistakes of yours. Stop being so unyielding. There's nothing you can do to defend yourself from this court. You have to confess. So confess to them as soon as you get the chance. It's only then that they give you the chance to get away, not till then. Only, without help from outside, even that's impossible, but you needn't worry about getting this help as I want to help you myself. You understand a lot about this court and what sort of tricks are needed," said Kay as he lifted her, since she was pressing in much too close to him, onto his lap. "That's all right," then she said, and made herself comfortable on his lap by smoothing out her skirt and adjusting her blouse. Then she hung both her arms around his neck, leant back and took a long look at him. "And what if I don't confess, could you not help me then?" asked Kay to test her out. "I'm accumulating women to help me," he thought to himself almost in amazement. "First Miss Burstner, then the court usher's wife, and now this little care assistant who seems to have some incomprehensible need for me. The way she sits on my lap as if it were her proper place." "No," answered Leanie, slowly shaking her head, "I couldn't help you then." "But you don't want my help anyway, it means nothing to you, you're too stubborn and won't be persuaded." Then, after a while, she asked, "Do you have a lover?" "No," said Kay. "Oh, you must have," she said. "Well, I have really," said Kay. "Just think, I've even betrayed her while I'm carrying her photograph with me." Leanie insisted he show her a photograph of Elsa, and then, hunched on his lap, studied the picture closely. The photograph was not one that had been taken while Elsa was posing for it. It showed her just after she had been in a wild dance, such as she liked to do in wine bars. Her skirt was still flung out as she span round. She had placed her hands on her firm hips and, with her neck held taut, looked to one side with a laugh. You could not see from the picture whom her laugh was intended for. "She's very tightly laced," said Leanie, pointing to the place where she thought this could be seen. "I don't like her, she's clumsy and crude. But maybe she's gentle and friendly towards you, that's the impression you get from the picture. Big, strong girls like that often don't know how to be anything but gentle and friendly. Would she be capable of sacrificing herself for you, though?" "No," said Kay, "she isn't gentle or friendly. Towards you, that's the impression you get from the picture. Big, strong girls like that often don't know how to be anything but gentle and friendly. Would she be capable of sacrificing herself for you, though?" "No," said Kay, "she isn't gentle or friendly, and nor would she be capable of sacrificing herself for me. But I've never yet asked any of those things of her. I've never looked at this picture as closely as you." "You can't think much of her," then said Leanie. "She can't be your lover after all." "Yes, she is," said Kay. "I'm not going to take my word back on that." "Well, she might be your lover now," then said Leanie, "but you wouldn't miss her much if you lost her, or if you exchanged her for somebody else, me for instance." "That is certainly conceivable," said Kay with a smile, "but she does have one major advantage over you. She knows nothing about my trial, and even if she did, she wouldn't think about it. She wouldn't try to persuade me to be less unyielding." "Well, that's no advantage," said Leanie. "If she's got no advantage other than that, I can keep on hoping." Has she got any bodily defects? Bodily defects? Asked Kay. Yes, said Leanie, as, I do have a bodily defect, just a little one. Look. She spread the middle and ring fingers of her right hand apart from each other. Between those fingers the flap of skin connecting them reached up almost as far as the top joint of the little finger. In the darkness, Kay did not see at first what it was she wanted to show him, so she let his hand to it, so that he could feel. What a freak of nature, said Kay, and when he had taken a look at the whole hand he added, what a pretty claw. Leanie looked on with a kind of pride as Kay repeatedly opened and closed her two fingers in amazement, until, finally, he briefly kissed them and let go. Oh! She immediately exclaimed, you kissed me. Hurriedly, and with her mouth open, she clambered up Kay's lap with her knees. He was almost aghast as he looked up at her. Now that she was so close to him there was a bitter irritating smell from her, like pepper. She grasped his head, leant out over him, and bit and kissed his neck, even biting into his hair. I've taken her place, she exclaimed from time to time. Just look, now you've taken me instead of her. Just then, her knee slipped out and, with a little cry, she nearly fell down onto the carpet. Kay tried to hold her by putting his arms around her, and was pulled down with her. Now you're mine, she said. Her last words to him as he left were, here's the key to the door, come whenever you want, and she planted an undirected kiss on his back. When he stepped out the front door there was a light rain falling. He was about to go to the middle of the street to see if he could still glimpse Leanie at the window, when Kay's uncle leapt out of a car that Kay, thinking of other things, had not seen waiting outside the building. He took hold of Kay by both arms and shoved him against the door, as if he wanted to nail him to it. Young man, he shouted, how could you do a thing like that? Things were going well with this business of yours, now you've caused a terrible damage. You slope off with some dirty little thing who, moreover, is obviously the lawyer's beloved, and stay away for hours. You don't even try to find an excuse, don't try to hide anything, no, you're quite open about it, you run off with her and stay there. And meanwhile we're sitting there, your uncle who's going to such effort for you, the lawyer who needs to be won over to your side, and above all the office director, a very important gentleman who is in direct command of your affair in its present stage. We wanted to discuss how best to help you. I had to handle the lawyer very carefully, he had to handle the office director carefully, and you had most reason of all to at least give me some support. Instead of which you stay away. Eventually we couldn't keep up the pretense any longer, but these are polite and highly capable men, they didn't say anything about it, so as to spare my feelings, but in the end not even they could continue to force themselves, and, as they couldn't speak about the matter in hand, they became silent. We sat there for several minutes, listening to see whether you wouldn't finally come back. All in vain. In the end the office director stood up, as he had stayed far longer than he had originally intended, made his farewell, looked at me in sympathy without being able to help. He waited at the door for a long time, although it's more than I can understand why he was being so good, and then he went. I, of course, was glad he'd gone, I'd been holding my breath all this time. All this had even more effect on the lawyer lying there ill. When I took my leave of him, the good man, he was quite unable to speak. You have probably contributed to his total collapse, and so brought the very man who you are dependent on closer to his death. And me, your own uncle, you leave me here in the rain. Just feel this, I'm wet right through waiting here for hours, sick with worry. Chapter 7 Lawyer Manufacturer Painter. One winter morning snow was falling in the dull light outside. Kay was sitting in his office, already extremely tired despite the early hour. He had told the servitor he was engaged in a major piece of work, and none of the junior staff should be allowed in to see him, so he would not be disturbed by them at least. But instead of working he turned round in his chair, slowly moved various items around his desk, but then, without being aware of it, he lay his arms stretched out on the desktop, and sat there immobile, with his head sunk down on his chest. He was no longer able to get the thought of the trial out of his head. He had often wondered whether it might not be a good idea to work out a written defense and hand it in to the court. It would contain a short description of his life and explain why he had acted the way he had at each event that was in any way important, whether he now considered he had acted well or ill, and his reasons for each. There was no doubt of the advantages a written defense of this sort would have over relying on the lawyer, who was anyway not without his shortcomings. Kay had no idea what actions the lawyer was taking. It was certainly not a lot. It was more than a month since the lawyer had summoned him, and none of the previous discussions had given Kay the impression that this man would be able to do much for him. Most importantly, he had asked him hardly any questions. And there were so many questions here to be asked. Asking questions were the most important thing. Kay had the feeling that he would be able to ask all the questions needed here himself. The lawyer, in contrast, did not ask questions, but did all the talking himself or sat silently facing him, leant forward slightly over the desk, probably because he was hard of hearing, pulled on a strand of hair in the middle of his beard, and looked down at the carpet, perhaps at the very spot where Kay had lain with Leanie. Now and then he would give Kay some vague warning of the sort you give to children. His speeches were as pointless as they were boring, and Kay decided that when the final bill came, he would pay not a penny for them. Once the lawyer thought he had humiliated Kay sufficiently, he usually started something that would raise his spirits again. He would then say, won many such cases, partly or in whole, cases which may not really have been as difficult as this one, but which, on the face of it, had even less hope of success. He had a list of these cases here in the drawer. Here he would tap on one or other of the drawers in his desk, but could, unfortunately, not show them to Kay as they dealt with official secrets. Nonetheless, the great experience he had acquired through all these cases would, of course, be of benefit to Kay. He had, of course, begun work straight away and was nearly ready to submit the first documents